The shotgun barrel didn't waver. Rose Bennett's finger rested on the trigger, her green eyes cold as winter stone, aimed directly at the stranger's chest. He'd ridden 12 miles across Texas hellfire to reach her isolated ranch, and now he stood there, dusty, exhausted, borderline insane, trying to explain why he'd come. "I saw a blue dress," Elias Mercer said quietly, watching death stare back at him. "And I couldn't stop thinking about the woman who ordered it." The silence stretched between them like razor wire. One wrong word, one false move, and this cowboy's journey ended in blood. Before I tell you how a piece of fabric changed 2 lives forever, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The Texas sun had been trying to kill Elias Mercer for 3 straight days. It wasn't personal. The sun didn't care about cowboys, cattle, or the fact that Elias had been riding since dawn with nothing but warm canteen water and jerky hard enough to break teeth. The summer of 1874 was simply brutal, indifferent, and endless, the kind of heat that turned the horizon into liquid shimmer and made men question whether the next town actually existed or was just another cruel mirage. Dry Creek wasn't a mirage, but it might as well have been. The town squatted in the dust like something dying slowly, a collection of weathered buildings baking under that merciless sky. Elias counted maybe 20 structures total: a general store, a saloon that looked barely functional, a livery stable, a few scattered businesses, and a dozen homes that seemed to sag under the weight of disappointment. This wasn't a frontier boomtown full of ambition and possibility. This was what remained after ambition packed up and moved somewhere with actual water. Elias didn't care. He wasn't staying. He never stayed anywhere long enough for it to matter. That was the whole point of being a drifter. You kept moving, kept working, kept your head down and your expectations low. Cattle drives paid decent money if you didn't mind eating dust, sleeping on rocks, and spending months with men who smelled worse than the livestock. Between drives, you drifted. Town to town, job to job, always alone, always temporary. 28 years old, and Elias couldn't remember the last time he'd called any place home. He tied his horse, a rangy sorrel mare named Rust, outside the livery and paid the stable hand to give her water, feed, and rest. The kid looked about 16, sunburned and skinny, with that hollow-eyed expression common to boys growing up in dying towns where the future looked exactly like the present, only poorer. "How long you staying?" the kid asked, already calculating whether the stranger might mean extra business. "Long enough to buy supplies and sleep somewhere that isn't moving," Elias said. "Maybe 2 days." The kid nodded like he'd heard that before and didn't believe it. People always said 2 days. Sometimes they meant it. Sometimes Dry Creek had other plans. Elias walked the main street slowly, feeling the weight of eyes on him. Strangers always drew attention in small towns, especially cowboys who rode in alone without a crew, without a brand, without any clear purpose beyond existing. He'd learned to ignore it. Let them stare. Let them wonder. He'd be gone before they finished speculating. The general store had what he needed: coffee, beans, ammunition, tobacco. The owner was a tired-looking man in his 50s who made small talk about weather and cattle prices while wrapping Elias's purchases in brown paper. Elias gave short answers, paid in cash, and was halfway to the door when something caught his eye through the window. Blue. Deep, rich, impossible blue. It stopped him cold. Across the street, displayed in the window of a tiny shop, a dress hung on a dressmaker's form. The fabric seemed to glow in the harsh sunlight, a shade of blue that reminded Elias of things he'd almost forgotten: midnight skies, deep water, something beautiful in a world that mostly dealt in brown dust and dried blood. He stood there staring like an idiot. The store owner noticed. "That's Mrs. Bellamy's place," he said, following Elias's gaze. "Dressmaker. Been here longer than most of us." "That dress," Elias said, still staring. "Who's it for?" The man's expression shifted slightly, something guarded sliding across his features. "Custom order, already spoken for." "I wasn't planning to buy it," Elias said. "Just asking." "Best leave it at that, then." But Elias couldn't leave it at that. He didn't understand why. The logical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through stampedes, storms, and violent drunks, told him to collect his supplies, find a bed, and forget about a piece of fabric hanging in some window. What the hell did he care about a dress? Except he did care. Somehow, inexplicably, he cared. He crossed the street before he could talk himself out of it. The dressmaker's shop was small and meticulously organized. Bolts of fabric lined shelves along the walls, arranged by color and weight. A sewing machine sat near the window, surrounded by spools of thread, pins, scissors, and pattern pieces. The air smelled like cotton and lavender. After months on the trail breathing dust and cattle, it was almost overwhelming. An elderly woman emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Bellamy, presumably. "Help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Drifter cowboys weren't typical customers. "The blue dress," Elias said, gesturing toward the window. "In the display." "It's spoken for. I heard. I'm not trying to buy it." He paused, feeling ridiculous. Who ordered it?" Mrs. Bellamy studied him for a long moment, clearly debating whether to answer. "Why do you want to know?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. It was the truth. "I saw it, and I needed to know." The old woman's expression softened slightly, like she recognized something in his face she hadn't expected. "Rose Bennett ordered it," she said finally. "Lives on a homestead beyond Archer Ridge. Widow. Lost her husband 2 years back." "She lives alone?" "She does." "Out there?" Elias knew the country beyond Archer Ridge. Harsh, remote, unforgiving land where survival was a daily negotiation with heat, drought, and isolation. "She's tougher than most men in this town," Mrs. Bellamy said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "Smarter, too. Works that ranch by herself, keeps it running, doesn't ask for help or charity." "Why'd she order the dress?" Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. "She said she wanted to allow herself something beautiful again. Said she'd spent 2 years in black mourning clothes and gray work dresses, and she was tired of feeling like grief was the only thing she had left to wear." Those words hit Elias like a fist to the chest. He stood there in the small shop, surrounded by fabric and thread, and felt something crack open inside him that he'd kept locked down for years. A woman he'd never met, living alone on a dying ranch in brutal country, had ordered herself a blue dress because she refused to surrender completely to loss. That took a kind of courage Elias wasn't sure he possessed. "Where exactly is this homestead?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes narrowed. "Now why would you want to know that?" "I'd like to meet her." "No." "No?" "Rose Bennett doesn't need some drifter cowboy showing up at her door uninvited," Mrs. Bellamy said firmly. "She's had enough trouble without adding more." "I'm not trouble." "Every man says that right before becoming trouble." Elias couldn't argue with the logic. He'd known plenty of cowboys who thought they were harmless right up until liquor, loneliness, or boredom turned them into something else. Still, this felt different. He felt different, though he couldn't explain how or why. "I'll leave if she tells me to," he said. "I just want to talk to her." "Why?" "Because," Elias struggled for words, "because someone brave enough to buy beauty after surviving that much grief deserves to know there are people who see it." Mrs. Bellamy stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. 12 miles northwest, she said quietly. "Follow the creek road until it splits at Archer Ridge, then take the western trail. You'll see the ranch, small house, barn, windmill. Can't miss it because there's nothing else out there. Thank you." "Don't make me regret this," Mrs. Bellamy warned. "Rose is a friend. If you cause her problems, you'll answer to me, and I'm meaner than I look." Elias believed her. The ride to Rose Bennett's homestead took nearly 4 hours. The creek road was exactly as bad as Elias expected. Rutted, dusty, and exposed to the full fury of the afternoon sun. Russ plodded forward with resigned patience, probably wondering why her rider had suddenly developed suicidal tendencies. 12 miles across open Texas wilderness to visit a stranger who hadn't invited him and would likely shoot him on sight. Yeah, Elias couldn't explain it either, but he kept riding. The landscape gradually shifted from scrubby flatland to rolling hills covered in tough grass and scattered mesquite. Archer Ridge appeared in the distance, a rocky outcropping that broke the monotony of the horizon. The trail split exactly where Mrs. Bellamy said it would, and Elias took the western fork. Another hour passed. Then he saw it, A small ranch tucked into a shallow valley where the land dipped toward a mostly dry creek bed. The house was simple, single story, built from weathered wood that had probably been decent once. A barn stood nearby, functional but showing its age. A windmill turned slowly, pulling water from what must be a stubborn well. Fences enclosed a few acres of pasture where half a dozen cattle grazed on whatever scrub they could find. It wasn't much, but it was something. Someone had built this, maintained it, kept it alive against odds that would have broken weaker people. Elias approached slowly, watching for movement. The sun hung low now, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Shadows stretched long across the yard. Rust's hooves crunched on dry ground, the sound carrying in the stillness. The front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch, and Elias's breath caught. She was younger than he expected, maybe mid-20s. Dark hair pulled back from a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, all sharp angles and strong features. She wore a simple gray work dress, dusty from labor, and boots that had seen serious use. And she was holding a shotgun. Not casually, not as decoration. She held it like someone who knew exactly how to use it and wouldn't hesitate. The barrel pointed directly at Elias's chest, steady and certain. "That's close enough," Rose Bennett called out. Her voice was clear, firm, without a trace of fear. "State your business or turn around." Elias reined in Rust and raised both hands slowly, making sure she could see he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "My name is Elias Mercer," he said. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "Then what are you here for?" "To talk to you." "We've never met. What could we possibly have to talk about?" "A blue dress." The shotgun barrel didn't waver, but something flickered across Rose's face. Surprise, confusion, maybe anger. "What did you say?" "Mrs. Bellamy told me about the dress you ordered," Elias said carefully, acutely aware that his life depended on choosing the right words. "I saw it in her window, and I needed to know who bought it." "You rode 12 miles because of a dress." "I rode 12 miles because I couldn't stop thinking about the woman brave enough to buy beauty after surviving grief." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the windmill and the occasional shift of cattle in the distance. Rose's green eyes studied him with an intensity that made Elias feel exposed, like she was reading everything he'd ever done or failed to do. "Mrs. Bellamy had no business telling you anything about me," Rose said finally. "She was reluctant. I insisted." "That doesn't make it better." "I know." Elias kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening. "You're right to be angry. I'm a stranger showing up uninvited, but I promise you, I'm not here to cause problems. I just wanted to meet you." "Why?" "Because," Elias struggled again to put the feeling into words. "Because I've spent years drifting from town to town, working cattle drives, sleeping under stars, never staying anywhere long enough to matter. And then I saw that dress, and Mrs. Bellamy told me about you, and I realized I'd never met anyone who decided to buy themselves hope. Not just survival, hope. That seemed worth riding 12 miles for." Rose's expression didn't soften, but the shotgun lowered slightly. Not much, just a few inches, but enough to suggest she wasn't planning to shoot him immediately. "You talk pretty for a cowboy," she said, her tone skeptical. "I read books when I can find them." "Books don't make you less dangerous." "No," Elias agreed. "But I'm not dangerous to you. You have my word. A drifter's word." Rose's laugh was bitter. "That's worth less than dust. Then judge me by actions instead of words. Let me stay tonight. In the barn, not the house. Let me work tomorrow. Fences to mend, wood to chop, whatever you need. If I'm not what I claim, you'll know by sunset. Then I'll leave. And if I just shoot you now and save the trouble, then I'll die knowing I tried." Rose stared at him for a long moment, clearly debating whether he was genuinely harmless or just better at lying than most. The smart choice was obvious. Send him away, keep the shotgun handy, protect herself and her land from yet another man who probably wanted something she couldn't afford to give. But something in her hesitated. Maybe it was exhaustion. 2 years of fighting alone would wear down anyone. Maybe it was curiosity about the kind of man who rode across wilderness because of a dress. Maybe it was just loneliness, though Rose Bennett didn't seem like someone who'd admit that weakness. "One night," she said finally, "in the barn. Touch anything you shouldn't, come near the house uninvited, or give me any reason to doubt you, and I'll put a hole through you big enough to see daylight. Understand? Yes, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am. Makes me feel old. Yes, Miss Bennett. Rose, if you're sleeping in my barn, you might as well use my name. She lowered the shotgun completely but kept it close. There's water in the trough. Your horse looks half dead. Tend to her first. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't earned it. She turned and walked back into the house, the door closing with a finality that suggested their conversation was over. Elias sat on Rust for another moment, processing what had just happened. He'd ridden 12 miles on instinct, approached a stranger's ranch uninvited, stared down a shotgun barrel, and somehow convinced a grieving widow to let him stay. Either he was the luckiest cowboy in Texas or the stupidest. Time would tell which. The barn was better than most places Elias had slept recently. It smelled like hay, leather, and old wood, familiar smells that reminded him of every ranch job he'd ever worked. The structure was solid, well-maintained despite its age, with a loft for hay storage and a few stalls for livestock. Currently empty except for Rose's horse, a sturdy bay gelding that eyed Rust with mild interest. Elias unsaddled his mare, rubbed her down, and made sure she had water and what little grain Rose kept stored in a barrel. Rust nickered softly, grateful for the care after a long, hot ride. Yeah, I know, Elias muttered, scratching between her ears. I'm crazy. You don't have to tell me. He spread his bedroll in the loft, far from the house and clearly separate from Rose's living space. The sun had set by now, the sky fading through shades of purple and indigo toward full darkness. Through the barn's open door, Elias could see lamplight glowing in the windows of the house. Rose was in there, probably cooking dinner, probably still debating whether allowing a stranger to stay was the stupidest decision she'd ever made. Elias didn't blame her for the suspicion. He'd met too many drifters who couldn't be trusted, men who'd steal, lie, or worse if they thought they could get away with it. The frontier attracted people running from something, and not all of them were running from bad luck. Some were running from consequences they'd earned, but Elias wasn't running from anything except emptiness. Years of constant motion had left him hollow, like he'd worn himself down to nothing through repetition and isolation. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, move on. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, move on. An endless cycle that paid enough to keep him fed but never gave him any reason to stop moving. He'd forgotten what it felt like to want something beyond the next paycheck, until he saw that blue dress. Now, he couldn't shake the image of Rose Bennett standing on her porch, shotgun in hand, every inch of her radiating strength and wariness and hard-won survival. A woman who'd lost everything and kept fighting anyway. A woman who ordered herself a blue dress because surrendering completely wasn't an option. Elias lay in the loft, staring at the rough wooden beams above him, listening to the night sounds. Crickets, distant cattle, the creak of the windmill, Rust shifting in her stall below. Somewhere in that small house, Rose was doing the same thing, listening, thinking, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Tomorrow, Elias decided, he'd prove she hadn't, if she'd let him. Dawn arrived like a hammer, sudden, bright, and unforgiving. Elias woke to the sound of a rooster screaming its lungs out somewhere near the barn. He'd slept surprisingly well considering the circumstances, though his back complained about the loft's hard planks. At 38, he wasn't old, but years of sleeping rough had accumulated in his joints like rust in metal. He climbed down quietly, splashed water on his face from the trough, and was checking Rust's condition when the barn door opened. Rose stood there with a tin cup in one hand and a biscuit wrapped in cloth in the other. She looked like she'd been up for hours, hair tied back, already dressed for work, eyes sharp and assessing. "You're still here," she said. Said I would be. Most men say a lot of things. She held out the cup and biscuit. Coffee and breakfast. Don't read anything into it. I'm not wasting food just because you're too stubborn to leave. Elias took both carefully, making sure their hands didn't touch. Thank you. Like I said last night, don't thank me yet. Rose crossed her arms, studying him in the growing light. You meant what you said about working. Yes. Good. The north fence line has 3 sections down. Cattle keep wandering into the scrubland, and I'm tired of tracking them. Can you handle fence work? I've mended more fences than I can count. Tools are in the barn. Posts and wire are stacked behind it. Work through the heat of the day if you're tough enough. She turned to leave, then paused. And Elias? Yes? Stay away from the house. I'll bring you water and lunch. But you don't come to the door, don't knock, don't make me regret this more than I already do. Understood. She left without another word, walking back toward the house with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had a full day's work planned and no time for distractions. Elias finished the coffee, strong enough to strip paint, and ate the biscuit while surveying the ranch in daylight. It was even smaller than it seemed at sunset. Maybe 40 acres total, most of it rough pasture with questionable water access. The kind of property that required constant attention and brutal labor just to break even. No wonder Rose looked like she'd been carved from stone. He found the tools exactly where she said: hammer, nails, wire cutters, post digger. The fence materials were stacked neatly despite being weathered and worn. Everything on this ranch was maintained with obvious care, even when resources were scarce. Elias loaded what he needed onto Rust and rode toward the north section. The damage was worse than Rose described. 3 sections down meant at least 50 yards of fence destroyed. Posts rotted through, wire sagging or broken, the whole structure barely holding itself together. This wasn't storm damage or accident. This was simple neglect, the kind of deterioration that happened when one person couldn't be everywhere at once. How long had Rose been fighting this alone? Elias dismounted and got to work. Digging new post holes in Texas hardpan was miserable labor. The ground fought every inch, baked solid by heat and drought. Sweat soaked through his shirt before he finished the first hole. By the third, his shoulders burned and his hands were raw despite the calluses. He kept digging. The sun climbed higher, turning the landscape into a blast furnace. Heat shimmered off the ground in visible waves. Elias worked methodically: dig, set post, tamp earth, attach wire, move to the next section. His canteen was empty by mid-morning, but he kept working. Around noon, Rose appeared on horseback. She rode the bay gelding with easy confidence, carrying a covered basket and another canteen. She stopped a careful distance away, clearly still maintaining boundaries. "You actually know what you're doing," she said, sounding faintly surprised. "Told you I did." "Men lie." Rose dismounted and set the basket on a flat rock. "Lunch. Don't waste it." Elias walked over, his legs stiff from crouching and digging. The basket contained more biscuits, some jerky, and an apple that looked like it might be the last one Rose had. "You don't have to feed me this well," he said. "You're working in heat that would kill most men. I'm not having you collapse from stupidity." She handed him the fresh canteen. "Drink, all of it. There's more at the house." Elias drank deeply, the water almost cool despite the temperature. It tasted faintly of metal and minerals, but better than anything he'd had in weeks. Rose studied the fence work while he ate. "You've done this before. Spent 3 years on a ranch in Kansas. Learned everything about fences, cattle, and disappointment. Why'd you leave?" "Owner sold the place. New buyer brought his own crew. I moved on." "You move on a lot." "I do." "Why?" Elias finished the apple before answering. "Because I never found a reason to stay anywhere. Never belonged to anything except whatever job I was working. Figured that's just how some lives go." Rose's expression was unreadable. "And now? Now I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong." She didn't respond to that, just collected the empty basket and canteen. "Finish what you can before dark. Don't kill yourself trying to impress me." "I'm not trying to impress you." "Then what are you trying to do?" "Prove I'm worth the chance you took letting me stay." Rose mounted her horse without comment and rode back toward the house, leaving Elias standing in the brutal sun with half a fence still to mend and questions he couldn't answer scratching at the back of his mind. 3 days passed. Rose kept saying one more day each evening, and Elias kept working. He finished the north fence, then moved to the broken gate on the east pasture. After that, the loose boards on the barn that had been threatening to fall for months. Then the clogged irrigation ditch, the weakened windmill platform, the rotted porch steps. Every job revealed 2 more waiting behind it. This ranch was held together with determination and spit, fighting a losing battle against time and entropy. Rose worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep ahead of the collapse, but one person couldn't maintain 40 acres alone. Elias worked beside her, not with her. She wouldn't allow that much closeness yet, but parallel to her efforts. He took the heavy labor, the dangerous repairs, The jobs that required strength or height or just brute stubbornness. Rose noticed. He could see it in the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to figure out his angle, waiting for him to reveal whatever selfish motive she assumed he must have. But Elias had no angle. He'd ridden 12 miles on instinct and discovered something he hadn't expected: purpose. Every fence he mended, every board he replaced, every hour of brutal labor under that merciless sun felt more meaningful than anything he'd done in years. This mattered. This ranch, this land, this woman fighting to keep it alive against impossible odds. It all mattered in a way drifting never had. On the fourth evening, Rose finally spoke more than basic instructions. Elias was washing up at the trough when she approached with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without ceremony and stood beside him, both of them watching the sun sink toward the horizon in shades of orange and red. "Why are you still here?" Rose asked quietly. "You keep letting me stay." That's not an answer. Elias sipped the coffee, buying time to find the right words. "Because I spent 10 years drifting from job to job, town to town, always alone, always temporary, and then I saw a blue dress in a window, and everything just stopped, like I'd been asleep and suddenly woke up." "That doesn't make sense." "I know, but it's true." Rose was quiet for a moment. "You're going to leave eventually. Men like you always do. The trail calls, or the work runs out, or you just get bored. This isn't permanent." "It could be." "No." Her voice hardened. "It couldn't. This is my land, my life, my fight. You're just passing through, same as every other drifter who's stopped here looking for a bed or a meal or whatever else they think a widow might give them. I'm not asking for anything except a chance to help." "Why?" Rose turned to face him directly, her green eyes intense. "Why do you care about any of this? You don't know me. You don't owe me. So why?" "Because..." Elias met her gaze and told the truth. "Because I'm tired of being alone. Tired of waking up in different towns and not remembering which one. Tired of working myself half to death for people who won't remember my name a week after I leave. And I think maybe you're tired of the same thing." Rose's jaw tightened. "Don't presume to know what I'm tired of." "Then tell me I'm wrong." She didn't. She just stood there, holding that coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her hands from shaking, staring at the sunset like it held answers she desperately needed. "My husband died in a flash flood," she said finally, her voice flat and controlled. "We were working the south section, clearing brush near the creek bed. Rain had been falling all week, but nothing serious. Then we heard it, the sound like thunder but constant, getting louder. We ran, but the water was faster. I made it to high ground. Tom didn't." Elias stayed quiet, letting her talk. "They found his body 3 miles downstream," Rose continued. "Took me 2 days of searching before I saw him caught in a log jam, already starting to..." She stopped, shook her head. "Doesn't matter. Point is, I lost him. Lost my partner, my help, my future. The bank wanted this land back. Neighbors said I should sell, move into town, find easier work. Everyone had opinions about what the poor widow should do. But you stayed." "I stayed," Rose's voice was fierce now, "because this ranch was ours. We built it together, fought for it together, dreamed about what it could become. I wasn't going to let his death erase all that. So I learned to do everything myself: fence work, cattle handling, water management, all of it. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. I stopped eating full meals. I stopped caring what anyone thought about whether a woman could run a ranch alone." "You proved them wrong." "I proved I could survive. That's not the same as being right." Rose turned away from the sunset, her expression harder now. "And then some drifter cowboy shows up because he saw a dress and thinks that means something. Well, it doesn't. That dress is mine. This ranch is mine. My grief, my stubbornness, my survival, all mine. You don't get to ride in here and claim any part of it just because you suddenly decided drifting was lonely." The words stung because they were partially true. Elias had been running from loneliness straight into Rose's isolation, hoping maybe together they'd cancel each other out. It was selfish, even if his intentions were good. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Rose blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. "What?" "You're right. I rode out here on impulse without thinking about how it might affect you.
I saw something beautiful and made it about my own emptiness instead of respecting yours. That was wrong. So you'll leave?
Elias looked at the ranch, the mended fences, the fixed barn, the stable windmill platform, all the work they'd done in 4 days, all the work still waiting. I'll leave if that's what you want, he said. But first, let me ask you something. Do you actually want me gone? Or are you just scared of wanting me to stay? Rose's coffee cup slipped. She caught it before it fell, but liquid sloshed over the rim, burning her hand. She didn't seem to notice. Get out, she said, her voice shaking.
Rose, I said get out! She hurled the cup at the ground where it shattered against the dirt. Pack your things and leave. First light tomorrow. I don't need your help, don't want your company, and I definitely don't need some cowboy telling me what I'm scared of. She stormed toward the house, her boots kicking up dust, her whole body rigid with fury or fear or something between. Elias stood alone by the trough, watching her disappear inside and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Somewhere overhead, the first stars were appearing. Tomorrow he'd ride away and probably never see Rose Bennett again. He'd go back to drifting, back to empty towns and temporary work, back to the hollow existence he'd been living before a blue dress changed everything. The smart thing would be to accept that and move on. But Elias Mercer had already proven he wasn't smart. He walked to the barn, pulled his saddlebags down from the loft, and started writing on the only paper he had, the back of a receipt from the general store in Dry Creek. If he was leaving, Rose deserved to know why he came. All of it. The whole truth, however foolish it sounded. He wrote until the lamplight grew too dim to see, then folded the letter carefully and tucked it under a stone on her porch, where she'd find it after he left. Then he went back to the barn, lay in the loft staring at darkness, and wondered whether leaving would hurt less than staying had. Probably not. But at least he'd tried. At least for 4 days, he'd belonged to something that mattered. That was more than he'd had in years. Elias woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving in the barn below. He sat up quietly, reaching instinctively for the rifle he kept close, and peered over the loft edge. Rose stood in the dim pre-dawn light, holding his letter. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore a nightgown covered by a heavy shawl. She must have found the note, read it, and come straight here without bothering to dress properly. Elias climbed down the ladder slowly, trying not to startle her. You were supposed to leave at first light, Rose said without looking up from the letter. I was planning to. This... She gestured with the paper, her hand trembling slightly. You wrote 12 pages. I had a lot to say. About a dress. About you. Rose finally looked at him, and in the weak light filtering through the barn cracks, Elias could see she'd been crying. Not much. Rose Bennett didn't seem like someone who cried easily, but enough that her eyes were red and her cheeks still damp. You wrote that you'd been drifting so long you forgot what hope felt like, she said, her voice rough. That seeing the dress reminded you beauty still existed. That meeting me made you remember what it felt like to care about something beyond just surviving. She lowered the letter. You wrote that I was the bravest person you'd ever met. You are. Stop. Rose shook her head. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you lost everything and kept fighting. I know you're running a ranch alone that would break most men. I know you ordered yourself a blue dress because you refused to let grief be the only thing you wore for the rest of your life. That's enough. It's not enough. Rose's voice cracked. You can't ride into someone's life and decide they're worth saving based on a piece of fabric and 4 days of fence work. That's not how this works. Then how does it work? I don't know. She sank onto a hay bale, suddenly looking exhausted. I don't know anymore. I thought I had everything figured out. Work hard, keep the ranch running, prove I don't need anyone. Simple, clean, safe. She looked up at him. Then you showed up and ruined it. I'm sorry. No, you're not. No, Elias admitted. I'm not. Rose laughed, a short, bitter sound. At least you're honest about being a problem. I don't want to be a problem. I want to help. Why, though? That's what I don't understand. What do you get out of this? Elias sat on the hay bale beside her, careful to leave space between them. A reason to stop drifting. A place that feels like it could become home. Work that matters beyond just collecting a paycheck. He paused. And maybe the chance to get to know someone who sees the world the same way I'm starting to. We barely know each other.
Then let me stay and change that. For how long? A week? A month? Until you get restless and ride off to the next town? What if I didn't leave? Elias asked quietly. What if I stayed here, worked this ranch with you, helped turn it into something sustainable instead of just survivable? Rose stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. You're talking crazy. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in years. You'd get bored. This isn't cattle drives in new towns. This is the same dirt, same cattle, same fight, every single day forever. I know. You'd resent me eventually, blame me for trapping you here. I wouldn't. You don't know that. You're right, Elias said. I don't know for certain, but I know I'm tired of running. I know I want to build something instead of just passing through. And I know... He stopped, trying to find the right words. I know that 4 days working beside you felt more real than 10 years of drifting. Rose was quiet for a long time, staring at his letter like it might contain answers beyond what he'd written. There's land, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Next to mine. 40 acres, abandoned after the previous owner died. Bank wants to sell it cheap. I thought about buying it myself, but I can barely afford what I have. What are you saying? I'm saying... Rose took a shaky breath. I'm saying if you're serious, really serious, not just romantic and stupid, you could file a claim on that land. Work it legally. Build something of your own next to mine. Then we'd see if you're actually built for this life or if you're just running from loneliness straight into a different kind of misery. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even an invitation to stay on her ranch. It was Rose Bennett being practical, cautious, and self-protective while still leaving the door open a crack. It was perfect. I'll file the claim today, Elias said. You haven't even seen the land. Don't care. If it's next to yours, it's where I want to be. Rose finally looked at him directly, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or doubt. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. You'll need tools, supplies, seed money for livestock. I can't help with any of that. I have some savings. It won't be enough. Land claims are cheap, but everything else costs more than you think. Then I'll work twice as hard to make up the difference. You'll fail, Rose said bluntly. First year homesteading, most people fail. The land is unforgiving, the weather is brutal, and you're starting from nothing. Then I'll fail trying to build something instead of drifting toward nothing. Rose stood abruptly, wrapping the shawl tighter around herself. Don't make me regret this more than I already do. I won't. You can't promise that. No, Elias agreed. But I can promise I'll try. She walked toward the barn door, then stopped without turning around. The blue dress arrives next week. Mrs. Bellamy said she'd have it finished by then. I remember. When I wear it, Rose's voice was quiet, almost vulnerable. When I finally wear it, I want to believe it means something. That buying it wasn't just stubborn defiance, but actual hope. Can you understand that? Yes. Good. She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable in the shadows. Because if you're going to stay, Elias Mercer, you better be worth the hope. Then she left, walking across the yard toward her house as the first light of dawn began painting the horizon in shades of gold and rose. Elias stood in the barn doorway watching her go, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He'd ridden 12 miles because of a blue dress. Now he was betting his entire future on the woman who'd ordered it. Tomorrow, he'd ride into Dry Creek, file a land claim, and start building something permanent for the first time in his adult life. Tonight, he stood in a borrowed barn and watched the sun rise over a ranch that might, just possibly, against all logic, become home. The shotgun had lowered. That was something. That was everything. The land office in Dry Creek occupied a cramped corner of the general store, run by a clerk named Hoffman, who looked perpetually annoyed that anyone bothered filing claims at all. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink stains on his fingers, the kind of bureaucrat who treated paperwork like sacred text and human interaction like an unfortunate necessity. Elias stood at the counter waiting while Hoffman shuffled through forms with deliberate slowness, clearly in no hurry to help a cowboy who'd tracked dust across his recently swept floor. The Dawson property, Hoffman said without looking up. 40 acres, northeastern quadrant, adjacent to the Bennett homestead. That's the one. Land's been vacant 18 months. Previous owner died without heirs. Bank took possession. Hoffman finally glanced at Elias over his spectacles. You understand what you're buying? It's rough country. No house, no barn, no well. You'd be starting from bare dirt. I understand. Do you have the filing fee? Elias counted out $23 in worn bills and coins, nearly half his savings. Hoffman accepted the money with the enthusiasm of someone handling dead fish, then pulled out a claim form and began filling in details with meticulous precision. Name? Elias Mercer. Previous residence? No permanent address, been working cattle drives the last 5 years. Hoffman's pen paused. No references then. I can work. That's reference enough. The bank prefers claimants with established backgrounds, reduces the risk of abandonment. I'm not abandoning anything, Elias said firmly. I plan to build on that land and work it properly. Everyone says that, Hoffman returned to his form. Most fail within 2 years. The land breaks them, or the loneliness does. Or they simply realize frontier homesteading isn't the romantic adventure they imagined. Good thing I'm not looking for romance. Hoffman made a sound that might have been a laugh, or just bureaucratic skepticism. He finished the paperwork, pressed an official stamp onto the document with unnecessary force, and slid it across the counter. Congratulations, Mr. Mercer. You now own 40 acres of rock, scrub, and regret. Pay your property taxes annually or the bank reclaims it. Build a permanent structure within 3 years or forfeit your claim. Don't let your cattle drift onto neighboring property or face legal action. He pushed his spectacles up. Any questions? Just one? Where's the nearest lumber supplier? Dalton's Mill, 30 miles east, but I'd wait if I were you. Why? Because buying lumber before you've surveyed your land, secured water rights, and planned actual structures is how fools go bankrupt. Hoffman's expression was almost pitying. At least walk the property first. You might discover it's worthless and save yourself the expense. Elias folded the claim document carefully and tucked it inside his shirt. Appreciate the advice. You won't follow it. Probably not. Hoffman shook his head and returned to his ledgers, already dismissing Elias as another doomed dreamer who'd be selling out or disappearing within a year. Elias didn't care. He had what he came for, legal ownership of 40 acres next to Rose Bennett's ranch. Whether Hoffman believed in him was irrelevant. Whether Elias himself believed was almost irrelevant. He was committed now, for better or worse. Outside, the afternoon sun hammered down on Dry Creek's dusty main street. Elias stood on the general store's porch for a moment, feeling the weight of the claim document against his chest. $23 and a signature had just changed the entire trajectory of his life. No more drifting. No more temporary work. No more waking up in anonymous towns wondering why he bothered. He was a landowner now, a homesteader, a man with something to build and something to lose. The responsibility felt heavier than any burden he'd carried on the trail. Mrs. Bellamy's dressmaking shop stood across the street, the blue dress still displayed in the window like a beacon. Elias crossed over and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The elderly seamstress looked up from her sewing machine, recognition flashing across her face. Mr. Mercer, I wondered if you'd survived your visit to Rose's ranch. Barely. She almost shot me. That sounds like Rose. Mrs. Bellamy set aside her work. But you're still here, and you don't look injured, so I assume she decided you weren't entirely worthless. She let me stay, worked on her ranch for 4 days. And now I just filed a claim on the land next to hers. Mrs. Bellamy's eyebrows rose. You're staying in Dry Creek. I'm staying. The old woman studied him carefully, the same assessing look she'd given him during their first conversation. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she smiled, not broadly, but enough to soften her weathered features. Well, she said, that's either the smartest decision you've ever made or the stupidest. Time will tell which. Everyone keeps saying that, because it's true. Mrs. Bellamy gestured toward a chair. Sit down. You look like a man who needs to talk, and I'm old enough that listening is one of the few useful things I can still do. Elias hesitated, then sat. The shop smelled like lavender and clean cotton, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted quietly. I've worked ranches, driven cattle, handled livestock and equipment, but building something from nothing, Starting a homestead alone on land I haven't even surveyed yet? That's different. It is, Mrs. Bellamy agreed. But you're not entirely alone, are you? Rose made it clear we're neighbors, not partners. I'm on my land, she's on hers. For now. Maybe permanently. Do you believe that? Elias thought about Rose standing in the barn at dawn, holding his letter with trembling hands. About the way she'd told him to file the claim instead of sending him away entirely. About the blue dress waiting to be finished and the woman brave enough to order it. No, he said. I don't believe it's permanent, but I also don't know what it could become. Mrs. Bellamy nodded knowingly. Rose has been alone for 2 years. Before that, she was married for 3. She spent her entire adult life either partnered or isolated, never anything in between. The idea of something gradual, something that builds slowly without formal definition, probably terrifies her. She's not the only one who's terrified. Good. Fear means you're taking this seriously. The seamstress returned to her sewing machine and resumed working on a hem. The dress will be ready in 4 days. Rose is supposed to collect it Friday afternoon. Will she? I don't know. She's been putting it off for weeks, finding excuses to delay. I think part of her is still afraid that wearing it means something she's not ready to admit. What does it mean? Mrs. Bellamy glanced at him, her needle pausing mid-stitch. That she's ready to live again instead of just survive. That she believes the future might hold more than endless work and loneliness. That hope is worth the risk of disappointment. She resumed sewing. All things that terrify someone who's already lost everything once. Elias understood that. He'd spent years avoiding hope for exactly that reason. Drifting was safe because nothing mattered enough to hurt when it ended. But safety was also hollow. Thank you, he said, standing, for telling me about Rose in the first place, for giving me her location. If you hadn't, I'd still be drifting somewhere. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Mercer. You haven't actually built anything. You're still in the easy part where everything is possibility and potential. Wait until winter hits or drought destroys your first crop, or you spend 6 months working yourself to exhaustion and barely break even. Then we'll see if you still think I did you a favor. Even if it all fails, at least I tried. That's the spirit that keeps this town alive, Mrs. Bellamy said dryly. Stubborn optimism in the face of overwhelming evidence that the universe doesn't care. Elias left the shop smiling despite himself. There was something comforting about the old seamstress's blunt pragmatism. She didn't pretend frontier life was romantic or easy. She just acknowledged it was hard and suggested trying anyway. That felt more honest than most conversations he'd had in years. He spent the rest of the afternoon buying supplies, basic tools, nails, rope, canvas for temporary shelter. His remaining savings dwindled with each purchase until he was left with maybe $12 and a growing pile of equipment that would barely scratch the surface of what he needed. Building a homestead required capital he didn't have, skills he was still learning, and luck that historically had never favored him. Elias loaded everything onto Rust and rode back toward Rose's ranch as the sun angled toward evening. The land looked different now that he owned part of it. Every rock, every scrub bush, every dried creek bed, it all mattered in a way it hadn't yesterday. This was his now. His responsibility, his opportunity, his problem. He reached Rose's property just before sunset and continued past her house toward the northeastern boundary. The 40 acres he'd claimed spread beyond her fence line, rough and untouched, exactly as Hoffman described. No structures, no water source immediately visible, no indication anyone had ever tried to work this dirt. Elias dismounted and walked the perimeter slowly, trying to visualize what it could become. A house here, barn over there, fencing to contain livestock, irrigation from wherever he could dig a well. The mental picture was hazy and probably naive, but it was something. You actually did it. Elias turned to find Rose riding toward him on her bay gelding. She wore work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, her expression unreadable in the fading light. Filed the claim this morning, Elias confirmed. Rose reined in and surveyed the land with a practiced eye. It's worse than mine was when Tom and I started. No water access, rocky soil, exposed to every storm that blows through. You'll need to dig a well at least 40 feet down, maybe deeper. I'll manage. With what money? Wells are expensive, so is lumber, livestock, seed, equipment, and everything else required to make this functional. I have some savings. Not enough. Rose dismounted and walked past him, examining the ground. You'll need at least $200 just for basics, more if you want anything beyond bare survival. Then I'll work for it, hire out to neighboring ranches, take whatever jobs I can find. That means leaving your own land unworked. You'll fall behind before you even start. Elias watched her pace the property line, clearly cataloging every problem and limitation. She wasn't being cruel, just honest. This was how Rose Bennett approached everything, by assessing the harsh reality first and then figuring out how to fight it. "Why are you here?" he asked. "If you think this is hopeless, why ride over to tell me?" Rose stopped walking. For a long moment she stood with her back to him, silhouetted against the darkening sky. "Because I remember what it felt like," she said quietly. "Starting from nothing, looking at empty land and trying to imagine it becoming home, being so scared and so determined that you can't tell the difference anymore." She turned to face him. "And I remember doing it with a partner, someone who shared the load, believed in the same dream, made impossible things feel almost manageable." "Tom." "Yes." Rose's voice was steady, but something raw flickered beneath it. "We were young and stupid and broke, but we had each other. That mattered more than money or experience. When the work felt crushing, we split it. When doubt crept in, we reminded each other why we started. When everything went wrong, and it did, constantly, we at least failed together." Elias understood what she wasn't saying. "And now you're watching me try to do it alone." "Which is exactly what I've been doing for 2 years. Rose walked toward him slowly. "So I know how hard it is, how exhausting, how some days you wake up and can't remember why you're still fighting. But you kept fighting, because I didn't have a choice. This ranch was all I had left of Tom, all I had left of the future we planned. Letting it die felt like losing him twice." She stopped a few feet away. "But you have a choice, Elias. You could still leave, go back to cattle drives, find easier work, stop pretending you're built for this kind of punishment." "I'm not pretending." "Then what are you doing?" "Building something that matters," Elias said. "Even if I fail, even if it breaks me, at least I tried to create something permanent instead of drifting until I died." Rose studied his face in the dimming light, searching for cracks in his conviction. "You're going to hate me sometimes. When the work is brutal and progress is invisible, and you're bleeding from a dozen cuts because nothing on a frontier homestead is safe or easy, you'll blame me for encouraging this insanity." "I won't." "You will. Everyone does. Tom used to joke that I was the reason he had splinters, cattle injuries, and permanent exhaustion." Her smile was sad. He was right too. Partnership means sharing the suffering, not just the success. Is that what we're doing? Partnering? The question hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. Rose's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elias thought she might retreat behind walls again. But she didn't. "I don't know what we're doing," she admitted. "But I know I can't watch you struggle alone on land right next to mine and pretend I don't see it. That's not who I am." She took a breath. "So here's what I propose. You work your land and I'll work mine, but we share resources. Tools, equipment, water from my well until you dig yours. When I need heavy labor, you help. When you need expertise, I advise. We stay separate enough to protect ourselves, but close enough to actually survive." It wasn't a declaration of partnership or romance. It was a practical arrangement between two people who understood the frontier didn't care about feelings, only capability. It was perfect. "Deal," Elias said. Rose extended her hand formally, and Elias shook it. Her grip was strong, calloused, the handshake of someone who'd earned every inch of toughness through brutal experience. "Don't make me regret this," she said. "You've said that before." "Because I keep doing things I might regret." Rose released his hand. "Starting tomorrow, we figure out where to dig your well. That's the priority. No water means no homestead. Everything else comes after." "What about your ranch work?" "I'll manage. I've been managing alone for 2 years. Another few weeks of split focus won't kill me." She mounted her horse. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we work before the heat gets lethal." She rode back toward her house without waiting for a response, leaving Elias standing in the gathering darkness, surrounded by land that was legally his, but still felt impossibly foreign. He set up his bedroll under the stars that night, too tired and too broke to build even temporary shelter. Rust grazed nearby, hobbled loosely so she wouldn't wander. The night sky was vast and clear, Stars scattered across the blackness in patterns Elias had memorized during countless trail drives. But tonight they looked different. Tonight they hung over land he owned, marking the beginning of something he couldn't quite name but refused to abandon. Somewhere on the adjacent property, lamplight glowed in Rose's windows. She was probably doing the same thing he was, lying awake, questioning her choices, wondering whether this fragile arrangement between two damaged people could possibly work. Elias closed his eyes and listened to the night sounds. Crickets, distant cattle, the wind moving through dry grass. The frontier didn't promise success or happiness. It just offered space to try. That would have to be enough. The next morning arrived with Rose's voice cutting through pre-dawn darkness like a blade. "Get up, Mercer. We're burning daylight." Elias jolted awake to find her standing over his bedroll, already dressed for work and carrying 2 canteens. The sky was barely gray, stars still visible overhead. "The sun isn't even up," he muttered, "which means we have maybe 3 hours before the heat makes physical labor dangerous. Stop complaining and move." She dropped 1 canteen beside him and walked away, clearly expecting him to follow. Elias rolled out of his blankets, pulled on his boots, and caught up to her near the property line where she'd staked several markers in the ground. "We're looking for water signs," Rose explained. "Low spots where moisture collects, vegetation that stays greener than surrounding scrub, any indication underground flow exists. Texas aquifers are unpredictable. You might dig 40 feet and find nothing, or hit water at 20. We need to improve our odds." They spent 2 hours walking the property in systematic patterns, Rose pointing out subtle indicators Elias would have missed. A cluster of mesquite trees growing denser than usual, a depression in the land where ancient water flow had carved shallow channels, rocky outcroppings that suggested underground formations. "Here," Rose said finally, stopping near the western edge of his claim. "If water exists anywhere on this property, it's probably under this section. The ground slopes toward it, rock formation suggests aquifer presence, and that scrub oak over there is too healthy for pure surface moisture." Elias looked at the spot. Unremarkable dirt that looked identical to the surrounding landscape. "You're sure?" "I'm never sure about water. I'm just making an educated guess based on 2 years of experience and desperation." Rose dropped a marker stake. "But this is where I'd dig if it were my land." "Then this is where I'll dig. You'll need help. Digging wells alone is how people die. Cave-ins, exhaustion, hitting gas pockets. Tom and I dug ours together and it still nearly killed us." "Are you offering to help?" Rose hesitated, clearly weighing practicality against self-preservation. "I'll supervise," she said finally. "Make sure you don't do anything catastrophically stupid. But the actual digging is yours. I have my own work." They started that afternoon. Elias dug while Rose worked on her ranch nearby, checking on him every few hours to assess progress and make sure he hadn't collapsed. The Texas dirt was as unforgiving as Hoffman predicted. Hard-packed clay mixed with rock, fighting every shovel thrust like it had personal grudges against homesteaders. By sunset, Elias had managed maybe 4 feet of depth and had blisters on top of blisters. His shoulders screamed, his back felt like someone had beaten it with clubs, and his hands were raw despite gloves. Rose inspected the work without comment, then handed him a tin of salve. "For the blisters. Don't be stupid and work without treating them. Infection out here means losing fingers, or worse." "Thanks. And drink more water. You're dehydrated." "I'm fine." "You're an idiot. Drink." She waited until he'd emptied an entire canteen before nodding. "Better. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be worse." She was right. The next day, Elias dug from dawn until heat exhaustion forced him to stop. 5 more feet of depth, each one harder than the last. His body was failing in new and creative ways. Muscles he didn't know existed announced their presence through searing pain. Rose brought food at midday, watched him eat mechanically, and didn't comment on how he could barely lift the spoon. "Tom cried the 3rd day we dug our well," she said quietly. "Just sat at the bottom of that hole and cried because his hands were bleeding and his body was breaking and he couldn't see how we'd ever reach water." "What did you do?" "Climbed down there with him. Cried too. Then we got back to work." Elias looked at her, this woman who'd survived everything the frontier threw at her through sheer refusing to quit stubbornness. "Did you ever think about giving up?" "Every single day." Rose's smile was grim. "Still do sometimes, but giving up means losing. and I'm too mean to lose." She left him to keep digging. 14 days later, at 26 feet down, Elias hit water. The moment his shovel broke through into dampness, he stopped moving, afraid he'd imagined it. Then water began seeping into the hole. Slowly at first, then faster, as the aquifer released pressure it had been holding for who knew how long. Elias climbed out of the well shaft, shaking, covered in mud and exhaustion, and collapsed on the ground beside the opening. Rose rode up minutes later, somehow knowing without being told. She dismounted, looked into the well, then sat down beside him. "Congratulations," she said. "You have water. Now the real work starts." Elias laughed, partly from relief, partly from hysteria. "That wasn't the real work. That was the foundation. Everything else builds from here." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward evening. Elias's entire body hurt. His hands were destroyed despite daily treatment, and he'd probably aged 5 years in 2 weeks. But he had water. His land had a functioning well. It was something. It was everything. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting me do this completely alone." Rose didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than usual. "Tom used to say frontier life was too hard for solo heroics, that survival meant accepting help even when pride said otherwise." She glanced at him. "I didn't understand that until after he died. Now I do." "Is that why you're helping me?" "Partly." Rose stood and brushed dirt from her clothes. "Also because watching you work reminds me why this land is worth the punishment. You're building something that matters, same as I am. That's rare enough out here that it deserves support." She rode away before Elias could respond, leaving him sitting beside his new well as darkness gathered and stars began appearing overhead. 3 weeks passed in a blur of brutal labor. Elias built a wellhead structure to protect the water source, then a small shed for tools and supplies. Then he started on fence posts, marking his property boundaries with the same careful precision Rose used on hers. They fell into an unspoken rhythm, working separately most days but sharing meals occasionally, trading labor when projects required 2 people, maintaining careful distance while somehow growing more comfortable with proximity. Rose never mentioned the blue dress, and Elias didn't ask. But Friday came, and Friday afternoon meant Mrs. Bellamy had the dress ready for collection. Elias was repairing fence line when he saw Rose ride toward town, her posture stiff with what might have been determination or dread. She didn't stop to talk, just continued past his property toward Dry Creek. 2 hours later, she returned carrying a wrapped package tied with string. Elias watched from a distance as she took the package into her house and closed the door. That evening, for the first time since he'd known her, Rose didn't come outside at all. The lamp in her window burned late into the night, and Elias wondered what was happening inside that small house. Was she trying on the dress, staring at it, regretting the purchase, crying over memories of who she'd been before grief rewrote her entire existence? He wanted to check on her, but knew better. This was Rose's private battle with hope and fear, and she'd fight it alone until she decided otherwise. 3 more days passed. Then, on Monday evening, as Elias was finishing work on his shed's roof, Rose emerged from her house wearing the blue dress. The sight of her stopped him cold. The dress fit perfectly, simple but elegant, the deep blue fabric catching the sunset light and transforming Rose from a frontier widow into something that existed beyond categories or definitions. She'd left her hair down, dark waves falling past her shoulders, and her expression was vulnerable in a way Elias had never seen. She walked toward his property slowly, each step deliberate, like she was testing whether the ground would hold her weight. Elias climbed down from the shed roof carefully, suddenly aware of how filthy he was, covered in sawdust, sweat, and construction debris. He probably smelled like livestock and exhaustion. Rose stopped a few yards away. "You were right," she said quietly, "about the dress meaning something." "What does it mean?" "That I'm ready to stop punishing myself for surviving." Rose's voice wavered slightly. "That I want to believe the future holds more than just work and grief. That maybe—" She paused, clearly struggling. "Maybe I'm allowed to hope again." Elias couldn't speak. Every word that came to mind felt inadequate or wrong. Rose looked at him directly, her green eyes intense. "I'm scared, Elias. Terrified, actually. Because hoping means risking disappointment, and I barely survived the last time I lost everything. What if I let myself believe in something and it destroys me again? Then we'll rebuild, Elias said. Same as you've been doing for 2 years. Same as I'm doing now. That's easy to say. It is. Doing it is harder, but I'd rather fail trying than spend the rest of my life too afraid to begin. Rose took a shaky breath. I think I want this. Whatever this is between us. Partnership, friendship, maybe something more eventually. But I need you to understand, I'm not whole. I'm damaged and difficult and so scared of loss that I push people away even when I want them close. I'm not exactly perfect either. I know. You're stubborn and reckless, and you made a life-changing decision based on seeing a dress in a window. Rosa's smile was tremulous. But you're also the first person in 2 years who looked at me and saw strength instead of something broken that needed fixing. Elias stepped closer, closing the distance between them carefully. You're the strongest person I've ever met. The dress just made me notice what was already there. Rose closed her eyes, and a tear escaped down her cheek. She wiped it away impatiently. I don't cry. I've spent 2 years not crying. Maybe it's time to start. She laughed and cried simultaneously, the sound raw and human and completely unguarded. Elias reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he wrapped his arms around her. Rose collapsed against him, finally letting the walls crumble, finally admitting she couldn't fight everything alone forever. They stood there as the sun set completely and stars emerged overhead, two damaged people holding each other in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by land they were trying to transform through stubborn hope and relentless work. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about frontier life ever was. But it was real and honest, and maybe, just possibly, it was the beginning of something worth the risk. The moment ended the way most real moments did, awkwardly, with both of them suddenly aware they'd crossed a line neither had planned to cross. Rose pulled away first, wiping her face and avoiding eye contact. I should go, it's getting dark and I have early work tomorrow. Rose, don't. She held up a hand. Please don't say something meaningful right now. I can't handle it. Elias nodded, understanding that vulnerability had limits and Rose had just hit hers. Okay. She walked back toward her house quickly, the blue dress catching the last remnants of sunset. At her porch, she paused without turning around. Thank you for not making this weird. It's already weird. I know, but thank you for not making it worse. She disappeared inside, and Elias stood alone in the gathering darkness, feeling like he'd just survived something dangerous without quite understanding what. That night he lay in his half-finished shed, staring at the ceiling boards he'd nailed in place that afternoon. Every muscle ached from weeks of relentless construction, but his mind wouldn't settle. He kept replaying the image of Rose in that blue dress, the way she'd looked simultaneously terrified and hopeful, like someone standing at the edge of a cliff trying to decide whether jumping meant flying or falling. He understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. Choosing to stay here, to build a homestead, to risk everything on land and a woman he barely knew, it was the same kind of leap. No guarantee of success, plenty of opportunities for catastrophic failure, and absolutely no way to predict the outcome. But drifting forever wasn't living. It was just slow motion dying with different scenery. Sleep came eventually, restless and shallow, filled with half-formed dreams about wells that never reached water and houses that collapsed before completion. Morning arrived too soon, announced by roosters, and the brutal reality that construction didn't pause for emotional exhaustion. Elias was hauling lumber when Rose appeared, back in her work clothes, hair tied back, expression carefully neutral. We need to talk about autumn, she said without preamble. Good morning to you too. I'm serious, Elias. Autumn means cattle management, harvest preparation, winterizing structures, and a dozen other things that need to happen before the first freeze. You have maybe 6 weeks to get your homestead functional enough to survive cold weather, or you'll spend winter in my barn eating through my supplies. I wasn't planning to I know you weren't planning anything. That's the problem. You've been building in reactive mode, fixing immediate needs without thinking 3 months ahead. That works in summer. It'll kill you in winter. She was right, of course. Elias had been so focused on basic infrastructure, well, shed, fencing, that he hadn't considered seasonal survival. Where would he sleep when temperatures dropped? How would he store food? What happened when storms made travel between properties impossible? Tell me what I need, he said. Rose pulled a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. I made a list. Priorities ranked by urgency. You won't finish everything, but if you complete the top 5 items, you'll probably survive. Elias scanned the list. At the top, in Rose's precise handwriting, 1. Permanent shelter with heating capacity. 2. Food storage, root cellar minimum. 3. Livestock shelter. 4. Firewood supply, minimum 3 cords. 5. Winter clothing and bedding. The scope was staggering. 6 weeks to build a house, dig a root cellar, construct a barn, harvest and split 3 cords of firewood, and somehow acquire winter supplies with money he didn't have. This is impossible, he said. Probably, but you'll try anyway because you're too stubborn to quit. Rose crossed her arms. I can help with labor on weekends, but my ranch needs most of my time. You'll have to work faster than you've ever worked, make smart choices about what's necessary versus ideal, and accept that nothing will be perfect. What about money? Half this list requires materials I can't afford. Then you get creative. Salvage lumber from abandoned homesteads. There are 3 within riding distance. Trade labor for supplies with neighbors who need help. Build smaller and simpler than you originally imagined. She paused. And accept help when it's offered instead of pretending you can do everything alone. Elias looked at her carefully. What kind of help? The kind where I loan you tools, materials, and expertise because watching you freeze to death is bad for property values. Rose's tone was dry, but something softer flickered beneath it. Also because I'd feel guilty, and I have enough guilt without adding dead neighbors to the collection. I'll pay you back. I know. Frontier economics runs on debt and barter. Just don't die before settling accounts. She left him holding the list, already moving on to her own work without waiting for thanks or acknowledgement. Elias stared at the paper for a long moment, then folded it and put it in his pocket. 6 weeks, 5 impossible tasks, no money, limited skills, and winter approaching like a slow-moving execution. He got to work. The next month passed in a blur of exhausting labor that made digging the well seem leisurely by comparison. Elias started with shelter because everything else depended on having a base structure. He rode to 3 abandoned homesteads Rose had marked on a rough map, salvaging every usable board, beam, and nail from buildings their former owners had surrendered to the frontier's relentless difficulty. The lumber was weathered and often damaged, forcing Elias to work around knots, warps, and rot. Nothing fit together cleanly. Every joint required adjustment, shimming, creative problem-solving. The house he was building looked nothing like the straight-lined structures he'd seen in town. This was a crooked, improvised shelter held together with determination and desperation. But it had walls, and a roof, and a stone fireplace he built with rocks hauled from a creek bed 2 miles away. Rose inspected the work on Saturday afternoon, walking through the single room with a critical eye. "It's ugly," she said finally. "I know. Walls aren't square. Roof's going to leak in heavy rain. Fireplace draws smoke, but barely." "I know. But it'll keep you alive through winter, which is more than most first-year homesteaders manage." She ran her hand along a support beam. "You did good, Elias. It's rough and amateur, but it's functional." The praise was so unexpected that Elias just stared at her. Rose noticed, and her expression softened slightly. "What? I can acknowledge competence. You usually acknowledge problems. Problems are easier to see than success. Doesn't mean I don't notice when someone does something difficult." She moved toward the door. "Now finish the root cellar before you celebrate. Food storage matters more than comfort." Digging the root cellar was worse than digging the well because the space had to be larger, a room rather than a shaft. Elias excavated behind his new house, carving into a hillside to create a naturally cool storage area. His body, already exhausted from construction, protested every shovel thrust. Rose helped when she could, working beside him in silence that had become almost comfortable. They developed a rhythm over the weeks, working hard, speaking little, trusting each other to handle their portion of the labor without supervision. One evening, as they took a water break, Rose spoke without looking at him. "Tom and I used to fight about root cellars. He wanted to dig ours deeper, make it bigger, perfect it. I wanted functional and fast. We compromised by making it medium-sized and arguing the whole time." Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he just listened. "I think he was right," Rose continued. Our cellar's too small. Every winter I run out of storage space and have to choose what to preserve and what to risk losing. If we'd built it his way, I wouldn't have that problem. You could expand it. I could, but then I'd be changing something we built together, erasing his choice. Feels wrong somehow. Or maybe it's honoring his memory by making his idea work better. Rose looked at him finally, something complicated in her expression. You're smarter than you look, you know that? I look pretty smart. You look like you've been kicked by a horse and dragged through a construction site. Both accurate. She almost smiled, which felt like a victory. The root cellar was finished by mid-September, lined with stone and fitted with a heavy door to maintain temperature. It wasn't perfect. Moisture would always be an issue, but it was functional. 3 down, 2 to go. Livestock shelter came next, a lean-to structure attached to the main house that would protect whatever animals Elias could afford to buy before winter. He built it in 4 days, working from dawn past sunset, his hands moving on muscle memory because his brain was too tired to consciously direct them. Rose brought dinner the 3rd night and found him still hammering by lamplight. You're going to injure yourself, she said, setting down a covered plate. Almost done. That's what you said yesterday. Yesterday I was lying. Today I'm telling the truth. Rose sat on a stack of lumber and watched him work. Why are you pushing this hard? You could slow down, build less perfectly, save your body. Because winter doesn't care if I'm tired. Elias drove another nail, the hammer strike echoing in the darkness. And because I need to prove I can do this. To you, to myself, to everyone who assumed I'd fail. You don't need to prove anything to me. Yes, I do. He set down the hammer and faced her. You took a chance letting me stay, helping me, opening up even a little bit. If I fail, if I quit, if I can't make this work, then I've wasted your trust. That matters more than my body hurting. Rose was quiet for a long time. You're an idiot. Probably. Definitely. She stood and picked up a second hammer from his tool pile. Show me what needs finishing. I'll help so you can stop before you collapse. They worked side by side until midnight, completing the livestock shelter by lamplight and stubbornness. When the last board was nailed, Elias sat heavily on the ground, too exhausted to stand. Rose sat beside him, both of them filthy and depleted. 4 down, she said. 1 to go. Firewood, 3 cords. That's the worst one. Chopping and splitting wood is brutal even when you're not already destroyed. I'll manage. You keep saying that. Rose leaned back against the wall. Eventually your body's going to stop believing you. Then I'll work faster before it figures out the truth. She laughed quietly. You really are an idiot. But she said it almost fondly. Gathering firewood consumed the next 2 weeks. Elias located dead trees, felled them with an axe that felt heavier every day, hauled logs back to his property, and split them into manageable pieces. The work was monotonous and agonizing, each swing of the splitting maul sending shocks through his arms and shoulders. Neighbors started noticing his efforts. A few stopped by, curious, skeptical, assessing whether this newcomer would actually survive or become another cautionary tale. An older rancher named Garrett rode up one afternoon while Elias was mid-split. Heard you filed claim on the Dawson property, Garrett said, not bothering with pleasantries. That's right. Also heard you're Rose Bennett's neighbor now. Elias set down the maul carefully. We share a property line. That all you share? The question was loaded with implication. Elias met Garrett's stare evenly. We help each other when it makes sense, same as any decent neighbors would. Rose doesn't need help. She's been managing fine alone. Everyone needs help sometimes. Garrett's expression was unreadable. You planning to stay through winter? That's the plan. Most don't make it. Land's hard, weather's harder. Year from now, you'll probably be gone, and this'll be vacant again. He turned his horse. But if you do stay, and you treat Rose right, you'll do fine out here. Hurt her or cause problems, and you'll wish you'd left voluntarily. He rode off before Elias could respond, leaving the warning hanging in the air like smoke. Rose appeared an hour later, clearly having heard about Garrett's visit. He threatened you? She asked. More like issued terms and conditions. That sounds like Garrett. He's been protective since Tom died, kept trying to convince me to sell and move into town. Rose picked up a piece of split wood, examining it. I think he felt guilty for not being there when it happened, like he should have somehow prevented the flood. Not everything can be prevented. I know, but knowing doesn't stop the guilt. She set down the wood. You don't have to prove yourself to the neighbors, Elias. Their opinions don't matter. Your opinion matters. I already told you. You don't need to prove anything to me. Then why do I feel like I'm constantly being tested? Rose turned to face him fully. Because you are. Not by me intentionally, but by circumstance. Every day you're out here is a test of whether you're serious or just romantic, whether you'll stay when it gets hard or run when it gets impossible. I'm not testing you, Elias. The frontier is. Same way it tested me, tested Tom, tests everyone who tries to build something here. And if I pass, then you'll have earned something real. Not handed to you, not given out of pity, but built with your own hands and stubbornness. She left him to finish the firewood alone. By late September, Elias had completed Rose's list. His homestead was rough, minimal, held together with salvaged materials and improvisation. But it existed. He had shelter, storage, firewood, and the basic infrastructure to survive winter. He also had blisters on top of calluses, muscles that screamed constantly, and exhaustion so deep he sometimes fell asleep mid-meal. But he'd done it. The first real cold snap arrived in early October, dropping temperatures overnight and coating everything in frost. Elias woke in his crooked little house, lit a fire in his barely functional fireplace, and watched smoke curl toward a sky that promised winter was coming, whether anyone was ready or not. Rose knocked on his door that morning, the first time she'd approached his house uninvited. "Testing the fireplace?" she called. Elias opened the door. "Seems to work." "Seems to is different from actually works. Let me check the draft." She stepped inside, assessing his single-room dwelling with the same critical eye she'd used before. But this time, with a fire burning and his few possessions arranged, the space looked almost livable. "You need better insulation around the doorframe," Rose said. "Wind's going to come through that gap all winter." "I'll fix it. And that corner where the roof meets the wall, that's going to leak." "I know. But overall," she turned slowly, taking in the whole space. "You actually built a house. A rough, ugly, barely adequate house, but a house nonetheless." High praise. Aye. It is actually. Most people quit before finishing. They build 3 walls and give up, or complete the structure but never move in because it's too hard. You finished. Rose moved toward the door. That means something. What does it mean? She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. It means you might actually belong here. Then she was gone, leaving Elias standing in his crooked house feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not in perfection, because nothing about his homestead was perfect. Pride in completion, in stubborn refusal to quit, in building something that would last beyond the moment. He spent the rest of October winterizing, fixing small problems, stockpiling supplies. Rose worked her own ranch with the same intense focus, both of them preparing for the hard months ahead. They fell into a pattern of evening visits, not planned, not scheduled, just one of them appearing at the other's property after work ended. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, too tired for conversation. One night, sitting on Elias's porch watching stars emerge, Rose spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about the dress." Elias waited, not pushing. "I haven't worn it since that first time. Feels too significant, like wearing it means committing to something I'm not sure I can commit to. It's just fabric." "It's not just fabric, you know that." Rose pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "It represents choosing hope over safety. Believing the future could be good instead of just bearable. That terrifies me." "Why?" "Because hope is dangerous. When you have it and lose it, the fall destroys you." "I know. I've experienced it. After Tom died, I spent months wishing I'd never met him because the pain of losing him felt worse than never having had him at all." "Do you still feel that way?" Rose was quiet for a long moment. "No, but I remember feeling it, and that memory is enough to make me cautious about hoping again." Elias understood that more than he wanted to admit. "So what do? Stay cautious forever?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to." She glanced at him. "But another part wonders if staying safe means staying alone. And I'm tired of being alone." "Me too." "I know. That's why you're here." Rose stood, brushing off her pants. "I should go. Early work tomorrow." "Rose?" "Yeah?" "Wear the dress when you're ready."
Not before, but don't let fear make that decision for you.
She nodded once and disappeared into the darkness. November arrived with brutal cold and the region's first serious storm. Rain hammered the landscape for 3 days straight, turning dirt roads to mud and testing every structure's worthiness. Elias's house leaked exactly where Rose predicted, forcing him to catch water in buckets and retar the roof between downpours. His fireplace smoked worse than usual, filling the small space with haze. Everything was damp, cold, miserable, but the house stood. On the 4th day, when rain finally stopped, Elias rode to Rose's ranch to check on her. He found her on her roof, patching damage caused by wind that had torn several shingles loose. "Need help?" he called up. "I've got it." "That's not what I asked." Rose looked down at him, clearly debating whether to maintain independence or accept assistance. Finally, she sighed. "Yeah, I need help. Ladder's around back." They worked together repairing the roof, Rose directing while Elias handled the heavy lifting. The work was cold and uncomfortable, fingers numb, clothes soaked from residual moisture. But they finished. Afterward, Rose made coffee and they sat in her kitchen, the first time Elias had been inside her house. The space was small but well maintained, everything organized with obvious care. A photograph on the mantel showed Rose and a dark-haired man Elias assumed was Tom, both of them young and smiling. Rose noticed him looking. "That was our wedding day. We were 21 and thought we knew everything. You look happy." We were. Naive and broke and completely unprepared for frontier life, but happy. She sipped her coffee. "Sometimes I wonder what Tom would think of me now, whether he'd recognize this version, harder, more cynical, less willing to trust. I think he'd be proud you survived. Maybe, or maybe he'd be sad I had to become this in order to survive." Rose set down her cup. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why haven't you asked about marriage?" The question caught Elias completely off guard. "What?" "We've been neighbors for 3 months, working together, helping each other, clearly moving towards something beyond friendship. Most men would have proposed by now, or at least hinted at it. But you haven't said anything." Elias chose his words carefully. "Because I don't want you to say yes out of practicality, or loneliness, or because frontier life is easier with a partner. If we do this, I want it to be because you actually want me, not because I'm the convenient option." Rose stared at him for a long moment. "That's either the most respectful thing anyone's ever said to me, or you're telling me you don't actually want to get married." "I want to marry you," Elias said quietly, "but I want you to be sure first. Not testing, not experimenting, not seeing if I'll stay. Actually, sure. What if I'm never sure? Then we keep being neighbors who help each other, and maybe that's enough." "Is it enough for you?" "Honestly, no, but I'd rather have that than force something you're not ready for." Rose stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the storm-damaged landscape. When she spoke, her voice was shaking. "I wore the dress again, 2 days ago. Put it on, looked at myself in the mirror, and tried to remember what hope felt like." She turned to face him. "And I realized I was thinking about you, about whether building a life together could actually work, about whether I'm brave enough to risk losing someone again. And I don't know, but I'm tired of being scared, tired of protecting myself from pain by refusing to feel anything good." She crossed back to where he sat. "So I'm not saying yes, not yet, but I'm not saying no either. I'm saying I'm trying. Does that make sense?" Elias stood, closing the distance between them. "It makes perfect sense. I might still run. I might wake up tomorrow and panic and push you away. I know. You could get tired of waiting for me to figure this out. I won't. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Elias took her hands carefully. "Because I didn't ride 12 miles for convenience or practicality. I rode here because something told me you were worth finding, and every day since has proven that instinct right." Rose's eyes filled with tears. She immediately tried to blink away. "I hate crying. Makes me feel weak." "You're the least weak person I know." "Then why does this feel so hard?" "Because it matters. Easy things don't scare us. This does because losing it would hurt." She pulled him into a kiss, sudden, fierce, almost desperate. It lasted maybe 5 seconds before she pulled back, breathing hard. "Sorry," Rose said. "I didn't plan that." Don't apologize. I needed to know if it felt real or if I was imagining things because I'm lonely. And? And it felt real. Terrifyingly real. She stepped back, putting space between them again. You should go. I need to think. Okay. I'm not pushing you away. I just need to process this alone. I understand. Elias left her standing in her kitchen, walked back to his homestead through mud and residual rain, and spent the night lying awake wondering whether he just moved forward or backward. Morning brought clarity in the form of Rose appearing at his door, holding 2 plates of breakfast. We're not talking about yesterday, she said, handing him a plate. But we're also not pretending it didn't happen. We're just existing with it, okay? Okay. They ate in companionable silence, and when Rose left, she touched his shoulder briefly, a small gesture that somehow meant everything. Winter deepened, and with it came the brutal reality of frontier survival. Temperatures dropped into the teens, livestock required constant care, and simple tasks became exponentially harder when performed in freezing conditions. Elias and Rose helped each other through it, trading labor and resources, covering for each other when exhaustion or cold made work impossible alone. And slowly, carefully, the distance between them continued shrinking. One evening in late November, Rose appeared wearing the blue dress again. She didn't explain why, just stood in his doorway looking simultaneously vulnerable and determined. I'm ready, she said quietly. For what? To answer your question, the one you haven't asked yet. Elias set down the book he'd been reading and stood. I haven't asked a question. You said you wanted to marry me. That's a question even without the words. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it. And your answer? Rose took a shaky breath. My answer is yes. Not because it's practical, not because I'm lonely, not because frontier life is easier with a partner, but because somewhere between shotgun threats and roof repairs, I fell in love with you, and I'm tired of being too scared to admit it. Elias crossed the small room and pulled her into his arms, and this time when they kissed, it wasn't desperate or uncertain. It was the beginning of something they were both finally ready to build. They stood there for a long moment, neither quite believing what had just happened. Rose pulled back first, her hand still resting on Elias's chest, her expression hovering between joy and terror. I might regret this tomorrow, she said quietly. You won't. You don't know that. No, but I know you well enough by now to understand you don't say things you don't mean. Elias brushed a strand of hair from her face. You've been fighting this for months. If you weren't sure, you wouldn't have said yes. Rose's laugh was shaky. I'm still scared. Me too. Really? Are you kidding? I'm terrified. What if I'm not good enough? What if I fail at this the same way I failed at everything else before coming here? What if... Rose kissed him again, cutting off the spiral of doubt. When she pulled back, her eyes were fierce. Stop. We're both scared and that's fine, but we're doing this anyway. She took a breath. When do you want to get married? The practical question caught Elias off guard. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Well, think now. Winter's here, which means the circuit preacher won't come through until spring. We could wait, have a proper ceremony, invite people? Rose paused. Or we could ride to Dalton's Mill next week. They have a justice of the peace who does legal marriages. What do you want? I want it done before I lose my nerve. Rose's honesty was almost painful. I don't need a big ceremony or witnesses or any of that. I just need us to commit before my brain convinces me this is a mistake. It's not a mistake. I know, but my brain doesn't always agree with my heart. Elias understood that completely. Next week, then. Dalton's Mill. Just us. Just us, Rose echoed, and something in her expression relaxed slightly, like she'd been bracing for him to want something elaborate she couldn't handle. She stayed that night, the first time they'd spent darkness together under the same roof. Nothing happened beyond talking and eventually sleeping, both too emotionally exhausted to think about anything else. But waking up with Rose beside him in the crooked house he'd built felt more real than anything Elias had experienced in his entire life. Morning arrived with Rose already awake, staring at the ceiling. I can hear you thinking, Elias said quietly. I'm not thinking. I'm panicking quietly. About what? Everything.
What if this doesn't work? What if we drive each other crazy? What if I'm too damaged to be a good wife?
Elias rolled onto his side to face her. What if none of that matters because we're doing this together? That's too simple. Maybe. But complicated hasn't worked for either of us so far. He reached for her hand. We're both broken in different ways. Maybe that's exactly why this could work. Rose turned her head to look at him. You really believe that? I do. Even though I'm difficult and stubborn and terrible at being vulnerable? Especially because of that. I don't want someone easy. I want you. She squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. We're really doing this. We really are. They told no one about the engagement. Rose insisted on keeping it private until after the actual ceremony, partly for practical reasons. Frontier gossip spread faster than wildfire, but mostly because making it public would make it harder to back out if she panicked again. Elias understood and didn't push. If Rose needed privacy to feel safe, he'd give her that. The week before their planned trip to Dalton's Mill, disaster struck the region in the form of early winter drought. Water sources that should have been flowing ran dry or reduced to trickles. Wells that had been adequate suddenly couldn't keep up with livestock demand. Across the county, ranchers started panicking as they calculated whether their water supplies would last until spring rains. Elias checked his well every morning, watching the water level drop slowly but steadily. Rose's well was in better condition, but still concerning. We need to reduce cattle numbers, Rose said one afternoon, standing beside Elias's well with a grim expression. Sell off or butcher anything we can't reliably water through winter. That'll hurt income. Income doesn't matter if the herd dies from dehydration. At least if we sell now, we get something back. They spent 2 days assessing both properties, counting cattle, calculating water needs, making brutal decisions about which animals stayed and which had to go. The math was depressing. They'd have to cut their combined herd by nearly 40%. This is going to set us back a year, Rose said, reviewing her notes. Maybe more. We were barely breaking even as it is. We'll recover. Will we? Every setback makes it harder. Every loss eats into reserves we don't have. She crumpled the paper in frustration. I've been fighting this land for 2 years, and sometimes it feels like I'm losing ground instead of gaining it. Elias had no good answer for that. Frontier ranching was brutal economics. One bad season could erase years of progress. They weren't losing yet, but they weren't exactly winning either. The trip to sell cattle took 3 days. Elias and Rose drove their combined herd to the railhead at Copper Springs, negotiated with buyers who knew desperation when they saw it, and accepted prices that were barely fair. They returned home exhausted and significantly poorer, but with enough cash to buy supplemental grain and water supplies if the drought continued. Still want to get married? Rose asked as they rode back, her tone trying for humor but landing somewhere closer to defeat. More than ever. Why? This is exactly the kind of disaster that should make you reconsider tying yourself to a failing ranch and a widow who can't catch a break. Because disasters are easier with a partner. You said that yourself. Rose was quiet for a moment. I did say that, didn't I? You did, and you were right. They rode the rest of the way in silence, both too tired to talk, but somehow the exhaustion felt shared rather than isolating. 3 days later, they made the trip to Dalton's Mill. The town was larger than Dry Creek, with actual commercial activity and multiple stores. The justice of the peace operated out of a small office above a bank, a thin man named Porter who looked like he performed marriages with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for filling out tax forms. Names? Porter asked, not looking up from his ledger. Elias Mercer and Rose Bennett. Ages? I'm 28, Elias said. Rose is 25. Previous marriages? Rose's jaw tightened. I'm a widow. How long? 2 years. Porter made a note. Any legal complications? Inheritance disputes? Property claims? Debt obligations that would affect marital assets? No, Rose said tersely. Good. Makes it simpler. Porter finally looked up. Fee is $3. Ceremony takes 5 minutes. I'll need 2 witnesses. You can grab anyone off the street if you didn't bring your own. The casual efficiency was almost offensive. This was supposed to be a significant moment, but Porter treated it like processing paperwork. Elias paid the fee while Rose went outside to find witnesses. She returned with 2 shop clerks who looked barely old enough to work, both clearly excited to be part of something more interesting than stocking shelves. Porter gestured them into position. "Let's get this done. I have another appointment in 10 minutes. The ceremony was exactly as promised. 5 minutes of legal language delivered in a monotone, with Porter asking required questions and Elias and Rose providing required responses. No music, no decoration, no attempt at emotion. When Porter declared them legally married, the two young witnesses applauded awkwardly. "Congratulations," Porter said, already turning back to his ledger. "Marriage certificate will be ready in 3 days if you want to pick it up. Otherwise, I can mail it." They walked out married, the whole experience so anticlimactic that neither quite knew how to react. "Well," Rose said finally, "that was romantic." Elias laughed despite himself. "We could have waited for the circuit preacher." "No, this was better, quick, efficient, no drama." She glanced at him. "Though I half expected you to write vows or prepare a speech. Would you have wanted that?" "Honestly, no. I would have cried and hated every second." Rose took his hand as they walked toward their horses. "This was perfect for us. Practical, simple, done." They rode out of Dalton's mill as husband and wife, though nothing felt particularly different. Same drought, same struggling ranches, same uncertain future. But now they were facing it together legally, not just emotionally. That night, they consummated the marriage in Rose's house. Elias's was too small and rough for anything beyond basic survival. The experience was awkward and imperfect, both of them too aware of vulnerability and past loss to fully relax. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Rose spoke quietly. "Tom and I were each other's first. We figured everything out together, made all the usual mistakes, learned as we went." She paused. "Being with someone new feels like betraying him, even though I know that's irrational." "It's not irrational. He's been dead 2 years. I should be past this. There's no timeline for grief. You loved him. That doesn't just disappear because you're ready to move forward." Rose turned to face him in the darkness. "Do you think about your past? Women you were with before?" "Honestly, there weren't many. Drifting doesn't encourage relationships, mostly brief encounters that meant nothing beyond a night." Elias pulled her closer. "This is different. You're different." "How?" "Because you're not temporary. Because I'm building a life with you, not just passing through. Because I actually give a damn whether you're happy." Rose was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. "I think I loved you before I was ready to admit it. Maybe as early as when you showed up uninvited and refused to leave quietly. That was good timing on my part. It was terrible timing. I was nowhere near ready. But you let me stay anyway. Because some part of me knew I needed you, even when I was convinced I didn't need anyone." She kissed him softly. "Thank you for being too stubborn to give up on me. Thank you for being worth the stubbornness." They fell asleep tangled together, and when morning came, they woke up married in reality instead of just legal technicality. The drought continued through December, forcing further cutbacks and constant vigilance over water supplies. Rose and Elias combined their operations officially now, managing both properties as a single unit. The efficiency helped, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem: too little water for too much land. Other ranchers were suffering worse. News filtered through the area of families abandoning homesteads, selling out to land speculators at devastating losses, giving up on frontier dreams that couldn't survive harsh reality. A speculator named Hackett started appearing at struggling ranches, offering cash for properties. His prices were insultingly low, but for people facing bankruptcy or starvation, insults were negotiable. Hackett showed up at Rose's ranch in mid-December. Elias was repairing fence when a buggy rolled up, carrying a well-dressed man who looked completely out of place in rural Texas. Hackett was maybe 50, with slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Looking for the property owner," Hackett called out. "That would be my wife," Elias said, already disliking this stranger. "Wife? I heard Rose Bennett was widowed." "She remarried. Who are you?" "Jonathan Hackett. I purchase properties from owners looking to relocate." He climbed down from the buggy, brushing dust from his coat like it personally offended him. "I'd like to discuss acquisition terms." Rose emerged from the barn, clearly having heard the conversation. "We're not selling." "Everyone says that initially. Hackett said smoothly. But circumstances change. Drought's been hard on the region. Many of your neighbors have already accepted my offers. Good for them. We're staying. Mrs. Mercer, it is Mercer now, correct? I'm offering fair market value for land that's rapidly becoming worthless. Water scarcity will only worsen. Cattle prices are dropping. The smart move is to sell while you can still get something. The smart move is telling you to leave, Rose said coldly. Hackett's smile tightened. I understand pride truly, but pride doesn't feed livestock or pay debts. I'm prepared to offer $1,800 for this property. That's more than most families see in 5 years. Not interested. $2,000 then. Final offer. My answer's the same at any price. This land isn't for sale. Hackett's pleasant facade cracked slightly. You're making a mistake. This drought could last years. You'll lose everything anyway, but without compensation. That's our risk to take, Elias said, moving to stand beside Rose. She told you no. Time to leave. Hackett looked between them, clearly reassessing. I see. The new husband wants to play hero. How noble. He climbed back into his buggy. When you're starving in 6 months, don't expect my offer to still stand. He drove off, leaving dust and tension in his wake. Rose watched until he disappeared, her expression hard. That won't be the last we see of him. Probably not. Men like that don't give up easily. He's buying up half the county. Within a year, he'll own more land than any 3 ranchers combined. Rose turned to Elias. And he'll keep pressuring us because our properties sit right in the middle of his acquisitions. We're obstacles to whatever empire he's building. Then we stay obstacles. It might get ugly. I don't care. Rose studied him carefully. You really mean that? You'd fight to keep land you've owned for less than 6 months. I'd fight to keep our land, yours and mine together. That's worth defending. Something in Rose's expression softened. We're really doing this. Building something permanent, fighting for it together, refusing to quit no matter what. We really are. She kissed him there in the dusty yard, and for a moment the drought and Hackett and all the other problems faded into background noise. Christmas arrived with no celebration beyond a slightly better meal than usual. Frontier life didn't pause for holidays, and neither of them had energy for festivities beyond basic acknowledgement. But Rose gave Elias a gift, a new shirt she'd sewn from fabric she'd been saving, practical but made with obvious care. Elias gave her a carved wooden box he'd built for storing her few precious items, including the blue dress she still wore occasionally when she needed reminding why she'd chosen hope. It's crooked, Rose said, examining the box. Everything I build is crooked. I know, but it's mine and you made it, so it's perfect. She set it carefully on her dresser. Thank you. They spent Christmas night talking about the future, what they'd build when drought ended, how they'd expand operations, where they'd eventually put the house that would replace Elias's rough shelter. Planning felt dangerous, like inviting the universe to destroy their dreams, but it also felt necessary, like refusing to plan meant surrendering to defeat. January brought the coldest temperatures in 15 years and, mercifully, rain. Not enough to end the drought, but enough to refill wells and give livestock desperately needed water. The relief was overwhelming. Ranchers who'd been facing ruin suddenly had breathing room. Rose and Elias worked through the cold and wet, repairing storm damage, managing livestock, making sure nothing critical broke when they couldn't afford repairs. One afternoon, checking cattle in the far pasture, they found 3 head dead, not from dehydration or starvation, but from gunshot wounds. Rose knelt beside the nearest carcass, her expression murderous. Someone killed them deliberately. This wasn't hunting accident or predator attack. Hackett? Maybe. Or someone he hired, sending a message that refusing his offer has consequences. Elias examined the other dead cattle, all shot cleanly, efficiently, killed for intimidation rather than meat or sport. The waste of it made his blood boil. We report this to the sheriff, he said. Sheriff's office is 30 miles away, and he won't care about dead cattle on remote property. We're on our own. Rose stood, her hands clenched into fists. This is how it starts. Small attacks, property damage, making life miserable until we're too exhausted to keep fighting. So what do? We bury these cattle, document the loss, and keep watching. If someone comes onto our property again, we defend it. Rose met his eyes. I won't be driven off land I've bled for. If Hackett wants a fight, He'll get one. They buried the cattle and increased vigilance, taking turns on night watch to make sure no one approached undetected. A week later, someone tried burning Elias's shed. They caught it early. Elias had been awake, restless, and saw the flicker of flame from Rose's house. He ran across the dark property and managed to extinguish the fire before it fully caught, but the message was clear: leave or escalation continues. Rose appeared minutes later, rifle in hand, searching the darkness for whoever had set the fire. "They're gone," Elias said, breathing hard. "Saw someone running toward the road but couldn't catch them." "This is getting worse." "I know." Rose lowered her rifle, her expression grim in the firelight. "We could sell. Take Hackett's money, relocate somewhere safer, start over." "Do you want to?" "No, but I also don't want you killed defending land we've owned less than a year." Elias pulled her close. "I've drifted for 10 years avoiding anything worth dying for. I'm not walking away from the first thing that actually matters." "Even if it kills you?" "Even then." Rose buried her face against his chest. "You're an idiot." "I know, but I'm your idiot now." She laughed despite the fear. "Yes, you are." They reported the arson attempt to neighbors who shared similar stories: vandalism, dead livestock, fires, all targeting people who'd refused Hackett's offers. A pattern of intimidation designed to drive holdouts into selling. Some neighbors did sell after that, exhausted by constant attacks and unable to afford the loss of property and livestock. But others, inspired by Rose and Elias's refusal to quit, dug in harder. A loose alliance formed, ranchers who'd decided they'd rather fight than surrender. They coordinated watches, shared information about suspicious activity, agreed to help each other defend properties. Hackett's hired thugs found it harder to operate when targets were organized and armed. February brought a confrontation that had been building for months. Elias and 2 neighboring ranchers caught 3 men trying to poison Rose's well. The fight was brief and violent. Elias took a knife slash across his ribs, but managed to subdue one attacker while his neighbors handled the others. They tied the 3 men up and rode to the sheriff's office 30 miles away, delivering evidence that couldn't be ignored. 3 hired criminals caught in the act of attempted property destruction. The sheriff, a weathered man named Clayton who'd been ignoring complaints for months, finally had to acknowledge the problem. "These 3 work for Hackett?" Clayton asked. "Don't know. They won't talk." Elias pressed a hand against his bandaged ribs. "But someone's paying them to attack ranchers who won't sell." Clayton questioned the prisoners for 2 hours before one finally broke and confirmed what everyone suspected. Hackett had hired them to make life miserable for holdouts, offering bonuses for anyone who drove a family off their land. "That's extortion and conspiracy," Clayton said. "Hackett's going to have legal problems." "Will he actually face consequences?" Rose asked skeptically. "He's wealthy and connected. Probably not jail time, but I can make his operations difficult enough that he'll move on to easier targets." Clayton looked at the 3 prisoners with disgust. "These idiots, though, they're going to prison. Legal consequences move slowly, but the immediate effect was that harassment stopped. Hackett's remaining hired men disappeared rather than risk arrest, and Hackett himself left the area for several months while lawyers handled his legal troubles. The victory felt hollow. They'd won a battle, but the war against land speculators would continue indefinitely. Still, it was something. Elias's knife wound healed slowly, made worse by his refusal to stop working. Rose yelled at him daily about rest and proper recovery, but Elias ignored her because cattle didn't care about injuries. One night, changing his bandages, Rose spoke quietly. "When I saw you bleeding, I thought I was going to lose you the same way I lost Tom. Just sudden violence taking away someone I loved." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're injured and stubborn and refusing to heal properly." She tied the fresh bandage with unnecessary force. "I can't do this again, Elias. I can't watch someone I love die because frontier life is brutal and unforgiving. I'm not going to die from a knife wound. That's not the point. The point is this life keeps taking, and I'm terrified of what it might take next." Rose's hands were shaking. "I thought I was strong enough to handle anything, but the idea of losing you breaks me in ways losing Tom didn't." Elias pulled her into his arms despite the pain in his ribs. "You're not losing me." "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I'll fight like hell to keep that promise anyway." Rose clung to him, and they stayed that way until her shaking subsided and fear released its grip enough to function again. Spring arrived gradually, bringing rain and new grass and the slow recovery of land that had been suffering for months. Wells refilled, cattle regained weight, the crushing pressure of drought eased into manageable challenge. Rose and Elias's combined ranch had survived its first winter, diminished but intact. They stood together one evening in late March, surveying land that was legally theirs and practically earned through blood, sweat, and refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier. "We should expand," Rose said suddenly. "What?" "That abandoned property to the east. Hackett owned it, but forfeited when legal troubles hit. Banks selling cheap. We should buy it, add another 40 acres to our operation." Elias stared at her. "We barely survived this year. You want to take on more land?" "I want to build something bigger than survival, something that lasts." Rose turned to face him. "We've been playing defense since you arrived, reacting, protecting, just trying not to lose. I'm tired of that. I want to go on offense, expand, improve, build something significant. That takes money we don't have. Then we find it. Work extra, save aggressively, borrow if necessary. But we do it together, and we build something worth the struggle." Elias saw the determination in her eyes and recognized it, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had kept her alive through 2 years of widow ranching. "All right," he said, "we expand." Rose smiled, and it was the first genuinely hopeful expression Elias had seen from her in months. They bought the additional land in April, leveraging everything they had and borrowing against future cattle sales. The debt was terrifying, but it was also a possibility. Working 3 properties instead of 2 meant even longer hours and harder labor, but it also meant legitimate ranching operation instead of marginal survival. They hired their first employee, a young ranch hand named Cooper who'd been orphaned and needed work. He was 17, skinny, and knew almost nothing about cattle, but he was willing to learn and work for modest wages. Rose taught him with the same blunt efficiency she'd used on Elias, while Elias handled the physical training, fence work, livestock management, basic construction. Cooper absorbed everything, grateful for the opportunity and determined to prove his worth. By summer, their operation was genuinely profitable for the first time. Not wealthy, not comfortable, but making actual progress instead of treading water. One evening, exhausted but satisfied, Rose and Elias sat on the porch of her house, their house now, watching sunset paint the sky. "You know what I realized?" Rose said. "What?" "I'm happy. Not just surviving, not just getting by, actually happy." She leaned against him. "I didn't think that was possible anymore." "Me either. We're really doing this, building a life together, making it work despite everything trying to stop us." "We really are." Rose turned to kiss him, and the blue dress she'd worn that first terrifying night hung in their bedroom closet, a reminder of the courage it took to choose hope over safety. They'd fought drought, land speculators, violence, poverty, and their own damaged hearts. And somehow, impossibly, they'd won. Not perfectly, not easily, not without scars and losses and moments of doubt. But they'd won, and that was enough. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were theirs. Rose discovered she was pregnant in the autumn of 1875, 16 months after marrying Elias. The news came during morning sickness that she initially blamed on bad jerky, until the pattern became too obvious to ignore. She told Elias while they were repairing a fence line, blurting it out between hammer strikes like she was confessing to property damage. "I'm pregnant." Elias missed the nail completely and nearly smashed his thumb. "What?" "You heard me. I'm pregnant. Due sometime in spring, best I can figure." He set down the hammer carefully, his hands shaking. How do you feel about that?" "Terrified, excited, angry that my body chose now when we're barely keeping ahead of expenses." Rose wiped sweat from her forehead. "Also relieved, which makes no sense, but there it is." "Relieved?" "That I can still have children. After Tom died, I convinced myself I'd never have a family. That chapter closed when he drowned." She looked at Elias directly. "But apparently it didn't close. It just paused." Elias pulled her into his arms, careful of her stomach, even though nothing was showing yet. "We're having a baby." "We are. And we're completely unprepared. We've been unprepared for everything else and managed fine." Rose laughed against his chest. "That's either optimism or delusion." "Probably both." Pregnancy was harder than Rose expected, made worse by her refusal to slow down. She worked through morning sickness, exhaustion, and her body's increasingly vocal complaints that ranch labor and growing a human were incompatible activities. Elias tried to take on more work to compensate, but that just meant both of them were constantly exhausted instead of just Rose. Cooper, now 18 and competent enough to handle significant responsibility, picked up the slack without being asked. He'd become more than hired help over the past year. Almost family, the younger brother neither of them had. "You should rest," Cooper said one afternoon, finding Rose trying to haul water despite being 7 months pregnant. "I'm fine." "You're pregnant and stubborn. Those aren't the same as fine." Rose glared at him, but the effect was diminished by the fact that she was visibly swaying from exhaustion. "Don't tell me what to do." "Then I'll tell Elias you're being reckless again." "You're a tattletale." "I'm practical." Cooper took the water bucket from her. "Go rest. I'll handle this." Rose wanted to argue but didn't have the energy. She retreated to the house, hating every second of forced inactivity, but knowing Cooper was right. Elias found her later sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon with an expression somewhere between contentment and fury. "Cooper said you tried working again." "Cooper needs to mind his own business." "Your health is his business. It's everyone's business." Elias sat beside her. "You're growing a human. That's harder than any ranch work. Stop trying to do both." "I hate being useless." "You're not useless. You're pregnant. There's a difference." Rose leaned against him, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "I'm scared, Elias. What if something goes wrong? Childbirth kills women out here all the time. No doctors, no help, just midwives and hope. Mrs. Garrett delivered 6 babies, and she's offered to help with ours. Mrs. Garrett is 70 and half blind. She's experienced and still alive, which is better than most options." Elias covered Rose's hand with his. "You're strong, stronger than anyone I know. You'll survive this." "You can't promise that." "No, but I believe it anyway." Their daughter was born in April 1876, during a spring storm that rattled the windows and made the midwife's arrival nearly impossible. Mrs. Garrett showed up soaked and irritable, took one look at Rose's condition, and started barking orders at Elias. "Boil water, bring clean towels, then get out of my way." Elias obeyed, grateful for clear instructions that gave him something to do besides panic. The labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of Rose's screams, Mrs. Garrett's stern encouragement, and Elias pacing outside feeling completely helpless. When the baby finally arrived, her first cry cut through the storm noise like a declaration of existence. Mrs. Garrett emerged from the bedroom, blood on her apron but smiling. "You have a daughter. Mother and baby are both alive and healthy." Elias felt his knees nearly give out from relief. "Can I see them?" "Give Rose a few minutes. She's exhausted." He waited what felt like hours, but was probably 10 minutes, then entered the bedroom to find Rose propped against pillows, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in clean cloth. She looked destroyed, pale, sweaty, clearly in pain, but her expression when she looked at their daughter was pure wonder. "She's perfect," Rose whispered. Elias sat carefully on the bed's edge, staring at the impossibly small face peeking from the blanket. Dark hair, eyes that would probably turn green like Rose's, tiny fingers that gripped his when he offered one. "What should we name her?" he asked. Rose had clearly been thinking about this. "Sarah, after my mother. Sarah Mercer." Elias tested the name. "I like it." "Good, because I already decided and I'm too tired to argue if you disagreed." He laughed quietly, careful not to wake the baby. "How do you feel?" "Like I was kicked by a horse from the inside. Also happy, also terrified." Rose adjusted Sarah slightly. "We're parents now, responsible for keeping this tiny human alive in a place that kills adults regularly. We'll figure it out." "Everyone keeps saying that. Nobody's explaining how." "Because nobody knows. We just do our best and hope it's enough." Rose looked at him, exhausted and vulnerable and more beautiful than Elias had ever seen her. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise that if something happens to me, you'll take care of her. Make sure she knows she was wanted and loved." "Rose, promise, Elias. I need to hear you say it." "I promise. But nothing's happening to you. You survived childbirth. The hard part's over." Rose smiled faintly. "The hard part's just beginning. but at least we're doing it together. Sarah was a difficult baby, colicky, resistant to sleep, seemingly allergic to quiet. The first 3 months were a blur of exhaustion, with Rose and Elias taking shifts trying to soothe their screaming daughter while still maintaining the ranch. Cooper helped more than they could have asked, handling morning chores so they could catch a few hours of sleep, never complaining when baby screams woke him at dawn. "You're going to make a good father someday," Rose told him one morning, handing over a finally sleeping Sarah so she could attempt breakfast. Cooper looked terrified holding the baby. "I don't know about that. You're patient, responsible, and you haven't run away despite living with the world's loudest infant. That's qualification enough." Slowly, impossibly, life found a new rhythm. Sarah's colic faded around 4 months, replaced by a personality that was equal parts curiosity and stubbornness. Clearly, her mother's daughter. The ranch continued growing. They added more cattle, improved infrastructure, built a proper barn to replace the lean-to structure that had barely survived winter. Money was still tight, but they were making genuine progress instead of just surviving. Other ranchers noticed. The Mercer Ranch, they'd combined the properties under one name, became known as the homestead that refused to quit. People pointed to Rose and Elias as proof that frontier life was survivable if you were tough enough and stubborn enough. Neither of them felt particularly heroic. They were just too invested to give up. Mrs. Bellamy visited when Sarah was 6 months old, making the trip from Dry Creek specifically to meet the baby. The elderly seamstress was grayer than Elias remembered, but still sharp-eyed and direct. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Bellamy said, holding Sarah with practiced ease. "Looks like her mother." "Poor thing," Rose muttered. "Nonsense. You're striking, and you know it." Mrs. Bellamy smiled at the baby. "This child is going to break hearts someday." They sat on the porch drinking tea while Mrs. Bellamy dispensed wisdom about child-rearing that Rose mostly ignored but appreciated anyway. "You know," the seamstress said eventually, "when that cowboy walked into my shop asking about the blue dress, I thought he was either a romantic fool or dangerous, possibly both." "What do you think now?" Elias asked. "I think he was a romantic fool who got lucky finding someone equally foolish." Mrs. Bellamy's expression softened. "But I also think sometimes fools are the only ones brave enough to try impossible things. Smart people calculate risk and walk away. Fools just build anyway." Rose laughed. "That's the nicest insult I've ever received." "It wasn't an insult. It was acknowledgement that you've built something significant here." Mrs. Bellamy gestured at the ranch, the house, barn, fences, cattle, all of it hard-won and maintained through relentless effort. "Most people fail at homesteading. You didn't just survive, you thrived. That's rare." After Mrs. Bellamy left, Rose stood holding Sarah and looking at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. "Do you think she's right?" Rose asked. "That we've actually built something significant?" "I think we've built a life. Whether that's significant depends on who's measuring." "And by your measurement?" Elias wrapped his arms around both of them. "It's everything." The years accumulated like fence posts. Steady, incremental, building something larger than individual moments. Sarah grew into a whip-smart child who inherited her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet determination. She learned to ride before she could properly talk, following Elias and Cooper around the ranch like a tiny, opinionated shadow. A second child arrived in 1879, a son they named Thomas, after Rose's first husband. Elias had suggested it, recognizing that honoring Tom's memory wasn't a threat but an acknowledgement of Rose's past. Rose cried when he proposed the name, then agreed immediately. Thomas was easier than Sarah had been, a calm baby who slept through storms and seemed content to observe the world quietly. Where Sarah demanded attention, Thomas simply existed peacefully until someone remembered to feed him. "He's going to be a rancher," Rose predicted when Thomas was 2. Patient, observant, unbothered by chaos. "And Sarah? Sarah's going to run something. A business, a town, possibly the entire state. That girl doesn't understand the word impossible." Elias watched their daughter chase chickens while their son sat placidly in the dirt examining rocks. "She gets that from you, and from you, don't pretend you're not equally stubborn. I prefer determined. Everyone does. Doesn't make it less stubborn." The ranch prospered through the 1880s, expanding to over 200 acres through careful purchases and strategic partnerships with neighbors. They weathered droughts, harsh winters, market fluctuations, and the constant unpredictability of frontier economics. But they weathered it together. Cooper eventually married a girl from Dalton's Mill and built a house on the eastern section of the ranch, staying on as foreman and becoming the brother Elias had never had. Rose's relationship with her children was complicated. She loved them fiercely but struggled with the vulnerability motherhood required. She'd spent years building emotional walls, and children had a way of demolishing them daily. One night, when Sarah was 8 and Thomas was 5, Elias found Rose crying quietly on the porch. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her.
I yelled at Sarah today. She was playing near the well, and I panicked, grabbed her too hard, screamed at her about being careful. Rose wiped her eyes angrily. She's 8. She doesn't understand why I'm so terrified of water, why wells and creeks make me irrational. Did you explain? How do I explain that I watched my first husband drown, that water took away someone I loved, and now I'm terrified it'll take my children too? Rose's voice broke. She thinks I'm just mean, and maybe I am.
Elias pulled her close. "You're not mean. You're scared. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where Sarah's standing, it probably looks the same." "Then tell her the truth. Age appropriate, but honest. She's smart enough to understand you're protecting her, not punishing her." Rose did tell Sarah eventually, sitting their daughter down and explaining about Tom, the flood, and why her mother sometimes overreacted to danger. Sarah listened with characteristic seriousness, then hugged Rose tighter than she'd ever hugged anyone. "I'll be more careful," Sarah promised. "I don't want you to be scared." The conversation didn't fix everything. Rose still struggled with fear. Sarah still occasionally forgot rules. But it opened a door to understanding that made their relationship stronger. The 1890s arrived with new challenges. Railroads were changing cattle economics, forcing ranchers to adapt or fail. Elias and Rose adapted, diversifying into horse breeding and expanding their crop production beyond basic subsistence. Sarah, now a teenager, showed aptitude for business that surprised everyone. She could calculate profit margins faster than most adults, negotiate with buyers without flinching, and spot bad deals from a mile away. "She's going to run this ranch someday," Cooper observed, watching Sarah argue a feed supplier into better prices. "If she doesn't leave for something bigger first," Rose said, "that girl's ambition doesn't stop at property lines." But Sarah showed no interest in leaving. The ranch was hers, her birthright, her future, her responsibility. She'd grown up watching her parents fight for every inch of progress, and she inherited their refusal to quit. Thomas, quieter but equally determined, developed into exactly the rancher Rose predicted. He understood cattle instinctively, could read weather patterns, knew which land would support what crops. Where Sarah handled business, Thomas handled operations. Together, the Mercer children represented the ranch's future. Elias and Rose watched their children grow and felt the passage of time in ways both painful and beautiful. They were aging, not old yet, but no longer young. Work that had once been merely difficult now left them sore for days. "We're getting old," Rose said one evening, watching sunset from the same porch where she'd once aimed a shotgun at a stranger. "We are. I have gray hair. I've had gray hair for years. You're just catching up."
Rose leaned against him, comfortable in a way that had taken years to build. "Do you ever regret it? Riding out here on impulse, tying yourself to a widow and her struggling ranch?" "Never. Not once. Not even when things were terrible? When we were broke, scared, fighting to survive? Especially not then. Those were the moments that mattered most." Elias took her hand. "Anyone can stay when life is easy. Staying when it's hard, that's when you know it's real."
"We've had more hard than easy." "I know, but we've had each other. That made the hard survivable." Rose was quiet for a moment. "I never thanked you properly for seeing me when I was at my worst and deciding I was worth the trouble anyway. You were always worth it. I was a mess, angry, scared, barely holding myself together. You were surviving impossible circumstances with grace and strength. That's not a mess. That's courage." Rose kissed him, and after 20 years of marriage, it still felt like coming home. Mrs. Bellamy died in the winter of 1897 at age 84. The funeral was small but well attended. She'd been part of Dry Creek longer than most buildings. Rose stood at the grave, holding the blue dress she'd preserved carefully over the years. "Should we bury it with her?" Elias asked quietly. "No. She made it for living, not dying." Rose folded the dress carefully. "Sarah should have it, when she's ready to understand what it represents." They gave Sarah the dress on her 18th birthday, along with the story of how her parents met. The blue dress in a window, the 12-mile ride, the shotgun greeting, all of it. Sarah listened with characteristic intensity, then held the dress like it was made of something more precious than fabric. "You rode 12 miles because of this?" she asked Elias. "I rode 12 miles because of what it represented. Your mother's courage to choose hope after losing everything." Sarah looked at Rose. "And you almost shot him?" "I considered it strongly. But you let him stay." "Worst decision I ever made," Rose said, then smiled. "And the best one." Sarah understood. She'd grown up watching her parents work side by side, fight side by side, build something significant through pure, stubborn determination. The dress represented all of that: the risk, the fear, the choice to try anyway. The new century arrived with celebration throughout Texas, though the Mercer Ranch marked the occasion quietly. No need for fireworks or speeches. Their success spoke louder than any celebration could. On the last night of 1899, Elias stood in the kitchen of the house they'd expanded over the years. It was larger now, properly built, home to 2 decades of memories. Through the window he could see the ranch sleeping under stars, the barn where he'd first spent a night, the well he'd dug by hand, the fences he'd mended 1,000 times, the cattle that represented years of careful breeding and management. Sarah and Thomas were asleep upstairs. Cooper's house showed lamplight in the distance. The land stretched in every direction, hard-won and hard-maintained, proof that impossible things were survivable if you were stubborn enough. Rose appeared beside him, handing him coffee without asking because after 25 years, she knew what he needed before he did. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything, nothing. How a blue dress changed my entire life." "It wasn't the dress. It was you being foolish enough to chase it." "Best foolish decision I ever made." Rose leaned against him, fitting perfectly in the space she'd occupied for decades. "Do you know what I realized?" "What?" "I'm not scared anymore. Not of loss, not of the future, not of any of it. We've survived everything the frontier threw at us. What's left to fear?" "Plenty, probably. Life always finds new challenges." "True, but we'll face them the same way we've faced everything else. Together, stubborn, refusing to quit." She looked up at him. "That's what the dress really meant, you know. Not just hope. Partnership. 2 people deciding impossible odds were worth fighting if they didn't fight alone." Elias pulled her closer, listening to the sounds of their home, children breathing upstairs, the windmill turning outside, the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. A lonely cowboy had once ridden across Texas wilderness because something told him a blue dress meant more than fabric. He'd found a widow with a shotgun and more courage than sense, and together they'd built something that would outlast both of them. Not a perfect life, not an easy one, but real and earned and worth every moment of struggle. The new century waited beyond the window, full of uncertainty and change. But Elias wasn't worried. He and Rose had survived drought, violence, poverty, loss, and their own damaged hearts. Whatever came next, they'd face it the same way they'd faced everything else, side by side, stubborn as Texas dirt, building something that mattered through sheer refusal to give up. That was enough. That would always be enough. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, the same way they had the night Elias first slept in Rose's barn, the night Sarah was born. Every significant night of the past 25 years. Constant, unchanging, witnesses to everything they'd built. Rose set down her coffee and took Elias's hand. "Come to bed. Tomorrow's another work day, and we're not getting any younger." "In a minute." "You always say that. This time I mean it." He turned to face her fully. "I love you. After 25 years, I still love you more than I did the day we married. Needed you to know that." Rose's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. "I love you too, even when you're stubborn and reckless and made me fall in love when I swore I never would again." They stood together in the warm kitchen, 2 people who'd survived everything by refusing to survive alone, listening to their home breathe around them. Eventually they went to bed, because Rose was right. Tomorrow was another workday, and the ranch didn't care about sentiment. But tonight they'd stood in the house they built and acknowledged something important. They'd won. Not perfectly, not without scars, not without loss. But they'd taken broken pieces and built something whole. They'd faced fear and chosen hope. They'd survived when survival seemed impossible. And it all started with a blue dress glowing in a window, and a cowboy foolish enough to ride toward beauty instead of away from it. Some people would call that luck. Others would call it fate. Elias called it the best decision he'd ever made. And as he fell asleep beside Rose, surrounded by everything they'd built together, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd make that same foolish choice again, every single time. The blue dress hung in Sarah's closet now, preserved and protected, waiting for the day she'd wear it and understand fully what it represented. Not perfection, not ease, but the courage to choose hope when safety seemed smarter. That lesson was the real inheritance. Not land or cattle or wealth, but the understanding that building something meaningful required risking everything, that love demanded vulnerability, that partnership meant fighting together instead of suffering alone. The frontier had tested them ruthlessly, and they'd passed by simply refusing to quit. That was the story the blue dress told. That was the legacy Elias and Rose built. And it was more than enough.